Gideon Rusk leaned over the fence rail and laughed so hard his face went red. 70 graves, he announced to the crowd, loud enough so everyone could hear. That girl just paid $6 for 70 graves. The men around him laughed. The auctioneer looked away. Nobody defended her. Mara Whitlock stood in the middle of that muddy stockyard, 18 years old, holding a receipt for every dollar she had left in the world, and she did not say a single word back. She just looked at those 70 coughing, trembling calves that no one else would touch, and something settled inside her chest. Not anger, not shame. Something colder and quieter than both. She had no idea that morning would be the one every person in that county would eventually have to reckon with. If this story already has your attention, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the stories we tell here don't go where you expect them to go. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because what Mara Whitlock did next took an entire community years to understand. The morning started the way most of the worst mornings do, without any warning at all. Mara had driven the old flatbed truck 4 hours southeast, from the family farm outside Caldwell County, Missouri, before the sky had even fully decided to get light. The heater worked only sometimes. She had one hand on the wheel and the other tucked under her thigh to keep her fingers from going numb, and she listened to the radio cut in and out across the flat highway until she finally gave up and drove the last hour in silence. She was 18. She weighed close to 260 pounds, and she knew it, and she knew other people knew it, and she had spent the better part of her adolescence learning how to carry that knowledge without letting it buckle her. It hadn't always worked. There were years when it hadn't worked at all. But on this particular November morning, with the truck cab smelling like old motor oil and the fields on either side of the highway flat and gray and dormant, she had something more specific to worry about. The farm was failing. Not the kind of failing that happens slowly and then surprises you. The kind that had been failing dark and had now and for years, now arrived at the place where something had to be done or there would be nothing left to fail. Her great-aunt Evelyn, who had worked that land for 50 years and raised Mara there after her parents left, was 73 and had a bad hip and hands that had started shaking in the mornings. The cattle they'd had were gone, sold off 2 years ago when they couldn't cover the cost of hay through the winter. The 60 acres were sitting empty. The farmhouse needed a new roof on the south side, and the well pump made a sound that no pump should make. Mara had graduated high school in May. She hadn't applied to college because the application fees alone would have felt like a decision they couldn't afford. She had worked at the feed co-op through the summer. She had saved $1,100 in change. And she had a plan that most people, if she'd told them, would have called somewhere between reckless and delusional. She was going to buy cattle. Not healthy cattle. Not the kind that went for $800 a head at a decent auction. She was going to try to find something that other people had given up on, because that was the only arithmetic that made any sense. You couldn't buy right with wrong money, but you might be able to buy cheap money and make it work through something other than capital. That was the theory. She hadn't told Evelyn the full shape of it yet. She told herself it was because she didn't want to worry her aunt before there was anything concrete to report. The honest answer was that she wasn't completely sure herself. The Grafton County Livestock Auction ran every Tuesday and the second Saturday of the month. Mara had driven down on a Saturday, which meant the barn would be full and the prices would be higher on the quality animals. But there would also be more of the other kind, the ones that came in at the tail end of the sale, so late, the ones the bigger operations had already cut from their herds, the ones nobody came to bid on. She'd been watching the online listings for 3 weeks before she came. She'd seen the lot marked as mixed stocker calves, weaned, some respiratory. That language meant something. She knew enough to know that some respiratory in a lot of 70 was probably closer to all respiratories was a respiratory, which was why the reserve price was low enough to look like a misprint. She got there early enough to walk the pens before the sale started. The smell hit her before she got through the gate. Not just the ordinary livestock smell of ammonia and hay and animals packed close together, but something's underneath it, wet, heavy smell of sick animals. She found the pen with the lot number and stood at the rail and looked at them, and her stomach did something complicated. they were bad. There was no prettying that up. Most of them were Angus crosses, 6 to 8 months old by the look of them, and they were thin in the way that sick things get thin, not just underfed, but hollowed out, like the illness had taken something from inside the frame. Several of them were standing with their heads low and their eyes half closed. 2 were coughing with that deep rattling chest sound that every cattle person recognizes and fears. 1 had nasal discharge so thick it had dried in a crust down her face. Mara stood there for a long time. She put her arms on the rail and looked at each one individually, the way Silas Whitlock had taught her to do, or rather, the way Evelyn had described Silas doing it, since Silas had been dead for 11 years, and Mara had only the second-hand versions of him. "You don't look at a herd," Evelyn had told her. "You look at animals. Each one is different. Each one is telling you something different." What these 70 were telling her was, "We are still here." That was the only message. Just that. We haven't lain down yet. An older man in a barn coat came and stood a few feet down the rail and looked at the same pen. He had a weathered face and a belt buckle that probably cost more than Mara's truck. "You bidding on this lot?" he said. "Maybe," she said. He looked at her. Not a hostile look, exactly, but a measuring one, the kind of look that takes in your age and your size and your worn coat and your gender and does a fast calculation. Mannheimer's whole operation folded, he said, gesturing vaguely at the calves. "This is what's left. Shipping fever went through about 6 weeks ago. Lost 40% already. These are the ones that didn't die, which I suppose tells you something, though I'm not sure it tells you much." "It tells me they can fight," Mara said. The man studied her for a moment. "It tells you they haven't quit yet," he said. "That's not necessarily the same thing." He walked away without introducing himself. She found out later his name was Gideon Rusk. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, 600 head, and he had been watching that pen all morning and had already decided the calves weren't worth the risk. He would tell people later that he'd thought Mara was somebody's daughter who had come along for the day. It wouldn't occur to him to think of her as someone with a plan. Yes. The auction hall smelled like coffee that had been sitting on a burner since 6 in the morning and sawdust and the particular cheap energy of men who are about to spend money. Mara found a seat near the back. The good cattle went first fat steers, clean heifers, bred cows that brought the kind of prices that made the buyers nod seriously and write things in notebooks. She watched the bidding the way she'd practiced, tracking the rhythm of it, noting which buyers kept going and which ones dropped out at what levels. The Mannheimer lot came up near the end of the morning session, and the change in the room was immediate and physical. The auctioneer's voice shifted into a different register, still professional, still moving fast, but with something underneath it that was almost apologetic. The screen behind him showed a photo of the lot that did those calves no favors. The opening bid was $50 a head. Nobody moved. The auctioneer came down, 40, 30, 20. There was a joke. Somewhere in the middle rows she couldn't hear the words, just the laughter that followed. The auctioneer looked pained. He brought it to $15 a head, which would have been $30 total for the lot, then to 10, and still the room stayed still. Finally, visibly uncomfortable, he said he was going to offer the entire lot as a single unit for a flat fee, and he started at $20 and came down from there. When he reached $6, Mara raised her hand. The silence that followed was the kind you could feel on your skin. Then someone laughed, and someone else said something she couldn't catch, and then Gideon Rusk's voice came from somewhere to her left, loud and carrying and enjoying itself. 70 graves. That girl just paid $6 for 70 graves. The laughter that followed was real laughter, not nervous, not embarrassed, just genuinely amused. Mara didn't turn to look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes forward and waited for the auctioneer to bang the gavel, and when he did, she got up and went to the window to pay. The woman at the window was probably 50 and had seen enough unusual things that her expression when Mara handed over the $6 was almost entirely neutral. Almost. There was something in the way she counted back the change, or rather, didn't count anything back, because there was no change to give that felt like a kind of sympathy Mara hadn't asked for. "You got a vet lined up?" the woman said. "Working on it," Mara said. "You'll need one." "I know." She had the number for a large animal vet in her pocket doctor. Anita Reyes, who had a mixed practice 40 minutes north of the farm, and whom Mara had called twice in the preceding weeks, to ask general questions about bovine respiratory disease. She hadn't told Dr. Reyes exactly what she was planning. She'd framed it as hypothetical. The vet had given her information in the careful way that professionals give information to people who are about to do something that might work out or might not, and who the professional doesn't want to discourage entirely, but also doesn't want on their conscience. Loading the calves took 2 hours and required the help of 2 stockyard workers who volunteered with the good-natured sufferance of men doing something they consider slightly absurd. The calves were weak enough that several had to be encouraged from behind, and one sat down entirely halfway up the ramp and had to be assisted by all 3 humans at once. Ma did not say the word sorry to the stockyard workers, but she thanked them twice, which felt inadequate given how much effort they'd spent. She drove back in the early afternoon with 70 sick calves in the trailer behind her and $6 less in her pocket than she'd had that morning, which meant she had exactly $47 and some change, plus the $300 she'd left at home in an envelope in the kitchen drawer that Evelyn didn't know about. For the first 2 hours, she ran the numbers in her head. The feed would be the first problem. Calves were weaned, but they'd been sick, and they needed quality forage and probably supplemental feed while they recovered. She'd already arranged for a round bale delivery from a neighbor, Earl Cossett, who would let her pay on 30-day terms because he'd known Evelyn for 40 years. The real problem was the vet costs. Antibiotics for 70 calves, even assuming a wholesale price on a treatment course, was going to be more than she had. She thought about this for most of the drive, and then she stopped thinking about it and just drove. There was a way her brain worked under pressure that she had come to rely on. Not optimism. Exactly, she'd learned early that optimism without specifics was just a way of avoiding the problem. But a kind of postponement that was different from avoidance. You couldn't solve the feed problem, and the vet problem, and the fence problem, and the hay problem, all at the same time on the road at 2 in the afternoon, with 70 sick calves in the trailer. You could solve one of them. So you started there. She called Dr. Reyes from the truck and told her what she'd done. There was a pause on the other end that lasted long enough to be its own kind of comment. 70 calves, Dr. Reyes said. Shipping fever. I think it's BRD complex. The ones that are still standing seem responsive. A few I'm worried about. You should be worried about more than a few. I know. Another pause. I can come out Monday. I can't do the whole lot in one visit. We'd have to prioritize. The ones showing acute signs first, then work through the rest. That's fine. What are we looking at for treatment costs? Dr. Reyes gave her a number. Mara wrote it on the back of her hand with the pen she kept in the cup holder. I can do a third down now and the rest in 90 days, Mara said. That's not usually how I work. I know. I'm asking you to make an exception. The silence this time felt different. Considering, not skeptical. You got family experience with cattle? My great-grandfather ran this land for 40 years. My great-aunt raised me on what he left. What happened to the operation? Bad years. Bad decisions that weren't her fault. She's 73 now. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. A third down Monday. I'll need you to do the record keeping. I'll walk you through the protocol. You'll need to log temp and respiration on each animal every morning. I can do that. 70 animals is a lot of mourning. I know. She got home just before dark. Evelyn was on the porch not waiting exactly, but standing there with her hands folded in front of her in the way she stood when she was trying to look casual about waiting. The sound of the trailer must have reached her before the truck was in sight, because she turned toward the driveway before the headlights could have told her anything. Mara parked and got out, and before Evelyn could say anything, she went to the back of the trailer and opened it. Evelyn came around the side of the truck and looked in, and for a long moment didn't speak. Lord above, she said quietly. Then she caught herself and said, How many? 70. How much? $6. Evelyn looked at the calves and then looked at Mara with an expression that was doing several things at once, something that was not quite alarm and not quite pride and not quite exasperation, but somewhere in the overlap of all three. $6, she said again, for the lot. Evelyn reached up and touched the cheek of the nearest calf, the one closest to the ramp. The calf flinched slightly and then didn't move. She's warm, Evelyn said. They're all warm. That's the problem and also part of the point. If their immune systems weren't fighting, their temps wouldn't be up. The ones that were completely flat didn't make it out of Mannheimer's operation. How many of these are going to make it? Mara paused. She'd thought about this answer for 4 hours on the road, and she'd decided on the truth. I don't know. Dr. Reyes is coming Monday. I'm hoping for 60%. 60% of 70-42 calves. If we get 42 through the winter at decent weight. Mara, Evelyn's voice was not unkind, but it was direct. Where is the feed coming from? Earl Cossett. 30 days. And after 30 days. After 30 days, we'll have a better count of who's standing. And we'll know more about what the land can carry once I clear the south pasture. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. The porch light was on behind her, and it caught the silver in her hair and made her look very old and very still. Your grandfather would have done something like this, she said finally, not approvingly, not disapprovingly, just observationally. I know, Mara said. He also nearly lost everything 3 times before he got it right. I know that too. Evelyn made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Well, she said, let's get them unloaded. The unloading took until almost 9 at night. Several calves refused the ramp and had to be guided one at a time. 2 had to be helped physically because their legs weren't steady. And Mara did most of that work herself because Evelyn's hip wasn't reliable enough on the uneven ground. By the time the last calf was in the quarantine lot, an old pen they'd cleaned out that afternoon, Mara's arms were shaking and her boots were wet through, and she was colder than she'd been all day. She stood at the fence and looked at 70 sick calves moving slowly around each other in the lamp, and she tried to locate something in herself that was confident, and she couldn't quite find it. What she found instead was a kind of stubbornness that had no particular shape or name, just the fact of her own continued standing. The fact that she had not left that pen in the auction barn and driven home and told Evelyn the numbers didn't work. She had a receipt for $6 in her coat pocket. She had $42 and change. She had a phone number on the back of her hand that was already beginning to smear. She had 70 animals that were still technically alive. From somewhere in the dark beyond the fence, one of the calves made a sound, the low, congested exhale of an animal breathing through inflammation, and Mara listened to it for a moment, and then she turned and walked back toward the house to write down Dr. Reyes's number on something that wouldn't wash off. The stars over the Whitlock farm were very clear that night. The temperature was dropping fast, the way Missouri nights drop in November, and by morning there would be frost on the ground. She was going to have to get up at 5 to check temperatures before the day got away from her. She didn't sleep particularly well, but she slept. That was something. That was enough for one night. The frost came before dawn, the way it always does in November in Missouri. Not announced, not gradual, just suddenly there when you opened the door and the cold hit your face like something with a purpose. Mara was up at 4:50. She hadn't set an alarm for him because she didn't trust herself to sleep through one. So she'd done the thing she'd done since she was 12 and had to catch the early school bus. She'd told her brain what time to wake her up and then let it do the work. Her brain, whatever its other failings, had never missed a target time. She pulled on her boots in the dark kitchen, drank half a cup of coffee that she'd set on a timer the night before, and went out to check the calves before the sky had decided on a color. She lost 3 that first night. She found them in the morning light, 2 in the far corner of the quarantine pen and 1 near the gate, and she stood there for a moment and looked at them and let herself feel exactly what she felt, which was a compound of grief and frustration and something very close to fear. Not about the money, though the money was real, but about the math. 67 now. 67 animals to work with, 67 chances. She'd been hoping to lose none in the first night, and she'd known that was probably too much to hope for, and she'd hoped it anyway, and now here was the cost of hoping too much. She pulled out the notebook she'd bought at the dollar store, the week before wide-ruled, bright yellow cover, the kind 6th graders used for math class, and she wrote the date and the number and the pen location and a brief physical description of each animal. She decided the night before that she was going to document everything, not just the deaths, everything. Temperatures, respiration rates, behavior notes, feed intake, anything she could quantify. She'd gotten that idea from Dr. Reyes's mention of record keeping, but it went beyond what the vet had meant. It went all the way back to something Evelyn had said once about Silas, that the man had never trusted his memory with anything important. Write it down, Evelyn had told her. What gets written down gets remembered. What gets remembered gets used. She worked through the remaining 67 animals before 7 in the morning, moving pen to pen with the thermometer and the notebook and a flashlight because the sky still hadn't fully committed to daylight. Most of the temperatures were elevated anywhere from 104 to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, which was high, but not catastrophic. Not yet. 2 animals were running 107 and change, and those she flagged with orange tape on the fence rail above, where they stood, so she could find them again quickly. She noted their ear tag numbers. She noted their posture, their eye clarity, which ones were eating and which weren't. By the time Evelyn appeared on the back porch at 7:30 with 2 cups of coffee, and that particular careful look she used when she was trying not to say the thing she was thinking, Mara had already been working for almost 3 hours. 3 down, Mara said before her aunt could ask. Evelyn nodded slowly. She handed over the coffee and looked out at the pens. Which ones? 2 from the far corner, 1 near the gate. The gate one, I think, was already too far gone when we loaded her. I noticed her on the ramp and I loaded her anyway. She paused. I don't know if that was right. Probably wasn't, Evelyn said. But I'd have done the same. That was the thing about Evelyn, she didn't comfort you with lies. She'd never done that, not when Mara's parents had left, not when the cattle operation had folded, not at any of the dozen small disasters that had come and gone on this farm in the years Mara had been here. She told you what was true, and then she stayed standing next to you while you dealt with it. Dr. Reyes is coming Monday, Mara said. That's 2 days. I know. You have enough money to pay her. It wasn't a question, but it needed an answer. I have enough for the deposit. The rest I told her 90 days. Evelyn looked at her sideways. You asked Anita Reyes for 90-day terms. I asked. She said yes. Anita Reyes doesn't give anybody 90-day terms. She gave me 90-day terms. Evelyn considered this for a moment. What did you tell her the truth? Something's shifted in Evelyn's expression. Not quite pride, she was too careful for that, too aware of how much could still go wrong. But something in the neighborhood of it. She looked back at the pens and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. What do you need me to do today? Mara had been thinking about that since 5 in the morning. The south water trough has ice on it. I need it broken twice a day. I'll do mornings, but if you can do afternoons just walking the perimeter, checking none of them are down. I can walk the perimeter. My hip is fine for walking the perimeter. Her voice had an edge on it that meant the subject was closed. What else? I need to move the 2 flagged animals to a separate pen. I don't want the sicker ones mixing with the ones that might be turning a corner. I'll do that this morning, but I need someone on the gate. I can manage a gate. They stood there for a moment in the cold, drinking coffee, looking at 67 sick calves moving slowly in the gray morning light. One of them coughed that deep, wet rattle that Mara had been hearing in her sleep since she'd gotten home, and then another, and for a moment the sound of it filled the yard. You should call Earl Cossett today, Evelyn said. About the hay. I was going to do it this afternoon. Do it this morning. Earl's good for 30 days, but he needs to hear from you first, not from the gossip chain. Half the county already knows what you did at that auction. Mara looked at her aunt. How? Because Gideon Rusk's mouth hasn't stopped moving since yesterday afternoon. Evelyn's tone was flat, factual, neither angry nor particularly bothered. She'd known Gideon Rusk for a long time, and she'd calibrated her expectations accordingly. He was at the Hendersons' place last night for their boy's birthday supper, and apparently he spent a fair portion of it describing what happened at the Grafton sale, particularly the part about the $6. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Not embarrassment. Exactly, she'd made her peace with the embarrassment in the auction hall, or at least she thought she had. It was something more specific than embarrassment. It was the awareness of being a story, of being the punch to a story that other people telling in warm houses over birthday cake while she was out in the frost, pulling dead calves out of a quarantine pen. What did he say exactly, she said. What you'd expect, Evelyn said. Heavy girl from the Whitlock place paid $6 for 70 dying calves. He apparently demonstrated the scene for them. You know how Gideon is. He can be very entertaining when someone else is the subject. Mara finished her coffee. The cup was cold at the bottom now, and it tasted bitter. Well, she said, he can keep talking. He will, Evelyn said simply. The question is what you do while he's talking. The answer to that was work. Everything else that's needed thinking about could be thought about while she was working, and most of it didn't need thinking about at all. The two flagged animals were moved to the smaller isolation pen by 9 that morning, with Evelyn on the gate and Mara doing the actual guiding, and both animals moved more willingly than she'd expected, which was either a good sign or a sign that they were too tired to resist, and she wasn't sure yet which. She logged them separately in the notebook. She checked their eyes. She talked to them while she worked, not because she thought it helped them, but because it helped her keep track of her own breathing. She called Earl Cossett at 10. Earl was 71 and had been running hay fields 2 miles north of the Whitlock place for 40 years, and had a voice like a gravel road and an almost total lack of interest in other people's opinions about things. He'd sold hay to Silas Whitlock when he was a young man, just starting out, and he'd watched the operation shrink and then collapse with the kind of quiet sadness that neighbors feel for each other's failures, which is different from the sadness you feel for your own. "Heard you were at Grafton yesterday," he said, before she could get past hello. "Word travels. Gideon Rusk was at the fuel station this morning. How many you end up with?" 67 after last night. "I'm hoping to keep most of them through the week." A pause. "What kind of forage you need," she told him. She told him the quantity, the quality, and the delivery schedule. And she told him about the 30-day arrangement she was hoping for, and Earl was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet when he was running numbers. "You pay me on the 1st of December, he said. "If you're short, I need a week's notice. I don't carry people past a week without notice." "Understood." "Thank you, Earl. Don't thank me yet." But his voice wasn't harsh, just honest. "You need anything else, you call." She hung up and looked at the notebook on the kitchen table. 3 dead, 2 in isolation, 65 in the main pen. She wrote the numbers down. She wrote down the hay arrangement and the date of doctor, Reyes's visit and the deposit amount and the 90-day balance. She wrote down the current temperature outside. She had a thermometer nailed to the barn door and had been checking it since morning, and the feed she'd given each subgroup and the water consumption as best she could estimate it. Evelyn came in from the cold just before noon and stood at the sink, washing her hands and watching Mara write. "What are you logging?" she said. "Everything," Mara said. Evelyn dried her hands and looked at the notebook. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then it shifted into something that Mara couldn't quite name, something old and specific, like recognition that has been waiting a long time to be recognized. "Your grandfather used to do that," she said. Mara had heard variations of this sentence her whole life. Usually it stopped there, at the comparison, at the implication of similarity, which was meant to be a comfort, and usually was. But this time, something in Evelyn's voice went further, and Mara looked up from the notebook. "Used to do what exactly?" she said. Evelyn pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, a thing she rarely did in the middle of the day. Her hip lowered her into it carefully, and she put both hands flat on the table in that way she had when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "He kept journals," she said. "Silas did. I don't know what happened to them. I thought they were lost. That's what I assumed when the estate was settled and we were going through the outbuildings. But I never actually went through everything in the attic. I haven't been up there in probably 12 years. She paused. "Your hip isn't my excuse. I didn't see the point, I suppose. There wasn't anything left to run." Mara looked at her for a moment. "He kept journals about the farm?" "About the land," Evelyn said. "That's the distinction he always made. He didn't keep records about the operation, he kept records about the land. Rainfall by month, where the grass grew and where it didn't, which pastures held water through August and which ones dried out by June. He had theories about the South 60 that nobody ever took seriously." She stopped herself. "I'm not telling you this for any particular reason. You're telling me because you think I should look in the attic," Marissa said. Evelyn almost smiled. "I'm telling you because I remembered it just now. What you do with it is your business." The attic was accessible through a pull-down panel in the hallway ceiling, and the ladder was original to the farmhouse, which meant it was old enough that Mara tested each rung before she committed her weight to it. The attic itself smelled like dust and old wood and the ghost of mouse activity that was hopefully historical. Were boxes, most of them unlabeled, most of them stacked without any system she could identify. There was furniture under sheets. There were mason jars with things in them she decided not to investigate. She found the journals in a cardboard box in the far corner, under a broken saddle and a stack of old farm magazines from the 1980s. There were 11 of them compositioned notebooks, the black and white kind, with Silas E. Whitlock written on the cover of each one in the careful, slightly cramped handwriting of a man who'd learned penmanship in a different era. She brought all 11 downstairs and set them on the kitchen table next to her own yellow notebook and looked at them for a long moment. Evelyn was in the other room. She didn't come in to look. Mara opened the first one. The date at the top of the first entry was March 1971. Silas had been 28 years old. His first entry was about soil moisture levels in the east pasture after a wet February, and it was written with the specific unsentimental precision of a man who did not trust vague impressions. He gave measurements. He noted where the water table sat, based on where the ground gave under his boots. He described the native grasses that came up in early spring, the big bluestem, the Indian grass, the switchgrass, and where they appeared first, and how that correlated with where the soil was healthiest. She read until her eyes started to blur, and then she made herself stop and go check the calves again, because the calves were the immediate problem, and Silas's journals would still be there at midnight. The afternoon was hard in a different way than the morning. The cold had settled in instead of lifting, which was unusual even for November, and 2 more calves had gone down by the time she made her rounds. Not dead down, which was different but not far from it. She got them to their feet again, both of them, by pushing from behind and making herself move their legs manually when they seemed to forget what legs were for. One of them looked at her with the flat, exhausted look of an animal that has stopped making calculations about the future. And she didn't look away from it. She held its face in both hands for a moment and felt the heat coming off it, and said quietly and without drama, "Not today. You don't get to do this today." The calf blinked. It didn't get up on its own, but it stopped leaning into her as hard. She got it to its feet eventually. She went back in and wrote it down. That night, after dinner, soup from a can and cornbread that Evelyn made from memory, and never from a recipe, she read Silas's journals. She read the third one first, because Evelyn had mentioned something about theories, and she thought the theories might be in the middle of the record rather than the beginning. She was right. Sometime around 1979, Silas had started writing longer entries, less data log, more argument with himself. He'd been reading, she could tell, though he didn't always cite what he'd read. He wrote about how the native prairie grasses had root systems that went down 12 feet in some cases, and how that meant they could access moisture at depths that conventional forage grasses couldn't reach. He wrote about how overgrazing destroyed those root systems and how it took years to rebuild them, and how the land that people wrote off as poor and dry was often land that had simply been asked to do the wrong thing for too long. She read that section 3 times. The South 60, he'd written in an entry, from the fall of 1983, was never poor land. It was asked the wrong question. A pasture doesn't fail. It answers what you ask of it. We have been asking it the wrong thing for 50 years and then blaming it for the answer we got. She looked up from the journal and out the dark kitchen window for a long time. Then she picked up her yellow notebook and started writing. Monday came with wind instead of frost, which was in some ways worse. The cold that moves is harder than the cold that sits still. Dr. Anita Reyes arrived at 7:30 in a truck that was even older than Mara's and climbed out wearing coveralls and an expression that was professionally neutral but had something alert underneath it. She was in her mid-40s, compact, brown-skinned, with short hair and the kind of hands that had clearly been inside large animals. She shook Mara's hand without ceremony and went straight to the pens. Mara walked her through everything. The numbers, the deaths 5 total now, over the first 3 days the isolation protocol, the temperature logs. She handed Dr. Reyes the yellow notebook and watched her flip through it without comment for almost 2 minutes. "You're logging rectal temps twice a day," Dr. Reyes said. "Morning and afternoon. I added a 3rd check at midnight for the 2 isolation animals. You're doing midnight checks." "I sleep light, doctor." Reyes looked at her over the notebook. "You've done this before. Not at this scale. But I grew up here, your great-aunt's place." "My place," Mara said, and the firmness of her own voice surprised her slightly, because she hadn't planned to say it quite that way. Dr. Reyes handed the notebook back. Something in her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "All right, show me the isolation pen first." The diagnosis she gave after 2 hours of working through the herd was what Mara had expected and feared: bovine respiratory disease complex, likely including both Mannheimia hemolytica and a secondary viral component. The treatment protocol was a broad-spectrum antibiotic course, tulathromycin on the acute cases and aggressive supportive care on the others. Dr. Reyes walked Mara through the injection technique with the patience of someone who has discovered that most people learn faster when you show them without commentary. The critical window is the next 10 days, Dr. Reyes said, while they were standing at the truck, writing up the treatment record. The ones that are still on their feet and eating even a little, those are your best odds. The ones that have stopped eating completely, those are the ones you watch hardest. I have 4 that haven't eaten since yesterday. Flag them. Keep them warm if you can. I know you don't have a heated barn, but windbreaks matter. Get them out of direct wind. I have straw bales along the north fence. Dr. Reyes looked at her for a moment. You set those up before I got here. Saturday morning. Okay. She wrote something in her own notebook. Call me any morning if you have a temperature above 107 that isn't coming down. Don't wait until I'm scheduled back. The deposit changed hands. It was a significant portion of what Mara had left. She counted it out without letting her face do anything, and Dr. Reyes took it without making a production of the moment, which Mara appreciated more than she could have said. The week that followed was the hardest of the weeks, and it was hard and specific grinding that she would remember not as dramatic moments, but as the accumulation of ordinary effort. She was up before 5 every morning. She checked temperatures. She administered antibiotics on the treatment schedule. She hauled water in 5-gallon buckets when the South Trough froze solid 2 mornings in a row, and she couldn't get the ice broken fast enough with the hand tool. Her hands cracked at the knuckles from the repeated cold and water exposure, and she taped them at night with the athletic tape she found in the first aid kit under the bathroom sink. Her body was, and she'd learned to be precise about this, not evasive, but not dramatic, either not built for this kind of physical labor the way some people's were. She carried weight that made the hauling harder, that made her hips ache by afternoon, and her lower back seize up at night when she finally stopped moving. She knew this. She'd known it since she was 12 years old, and first understood that her body was the thing people noticed about her before anything else. She'd spent years being angry about it, and years trying to pretend it wasn't true, and years trying to fix that work. Eventually, she'd arrived at something less clean than acceptance, but more functional than either anger or denial. Her body was what she had. It hurt in certain ways. She worked anyway. On Wednesday, she lost 2 more. That brought the total to 7 dead in 6 days, which was not the number she'd wanted. She stood at the fence in the gray mid-morning and did the arithmetic in her head. 63 remaining. 63 calves that were, at varying degrees, still fighting. She wrote it down and went to get the morning's second round of antibiotics. Evelyn, for her part, did what she'd promised, walked the perimeter in the afternoons, brought afternoon ice on the water trough, kept her own notes in a small spiral notepad she'd found in a kitchen drawer. She didn't say much. She didn't offer reassurance that wasn't warranted. And she didn't offer pessimism either. She was simply present, which was more useful than either. On Thursday, Mara found her in the kitchen with 2 of Silas's journals open on the table. I should have looked at these years ago, Evelyn said, without looking up. Her voice was quiet in a way that meant she was thinking about more than the journals. Mara sat across from her. Outside, the wind had died down, for the first time in days, and the afternoon was almost still. The entry from 1983, Mara said. About the South 60. Evelyn nodded slowly. He tried to tell me. I was thinking about the operation, about the cattle numbers and the hay costs and the equipment. He used to say I had my head in the books when I should have had it in the ground. She paused. I thought that was just his way of dismissing the financial realities. I was the one managing the money. I thought I understood what mattered. You both did, Mara said. Just different parts of it. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and straightened one of the journals on the table with the precise, unnecessary gesture of someone buying time to feel something. He mapped the whole South 60, she said. Did you see that? There are maps in the back of the 7th journal, where each grass species grew, where the soil composition changed. Mara had found the maps. She'd been studying them for 3 nights. The native grasses Silas had mapped were still there. She'd confirmed that by walking the 6 acres in the cold last weekend, moving through the dormant growth and recognizing the seed heads, the big blue stem, the Indian grass, dormant and buried under decades of neglect, but still there, still rooted at a depth that most people's idea of this land would never account for. He left us the answer, Mara said. He left us information, Evelyn corrected, with the precision that had made her a good farm manager and occasionally a maddening person to argue with. Whether it's an answer depends on what you do with it. Friday was the first day since the calves arrived that Mara woke up and found no new deaths. She walked the pens in the pre-dawn darkness and counted, and the number was still 63, and she stood there for a moment in the cold with the flashlight hanging at her side and let herself feel that not as a triumph, not as proof of anything, but as one morning where the number hadn't gone down. That was enough. That was for right now, enough. The 2 animals in the isolation pen were still standing. The one she'd forced to her feet on the second afternoon had eaten something the evening before. Not much, a few mouthfuls, but something. Mara had logged it in the notebook with what she recognized, even as she wrote it, as disproportionate satisfaction. It wasn't disproportionate, she decided. Every mouthful was a data point. Every data point was a reason to keep going. She was in the barn doing the morning injections when she heard a truck come down the drive. She didn't go look, because the injection schedule had a window and interrupting it was the kind of mistake that compounded. She finished what she was doing and came out to find a mud-colored pickup parked near the gate and a man leaning on the fence looking at her calves. He was not Gideon Rusk. He was younger, maybe 35, with a Carhartt jacket and the kind of deliberate stillness people have when they don't want to be mistaken for trouble. She didn't recognize him. "Help you with something?" she said. He turned. "You Mara Whitlock? That's me. My name's Dale Prentice. I've got a place about 8 miles east on Cutter Road. Heard you bought the Mannheimer lot at Grafton." He looked at the pens. "How many you still got?" 63. He was quiet for a moment. "I had 30 head of my own go down last week. Same thing BRD. Started with the calves I bought off a sale barn in September. I lost 11 before I got the vet out. I'm still working through the rest." He turned back to her. "I heard you had a protocol running. Temperature logging, twice daily checks. I talked to Anita Reyes, and she said you were doing things right." Mara looked at him. He was not asking for anything exactly. He was circling something. "What do you need?" she said. "I don't know, honestly. I think I needed to see if someone else was doing this and it was working. Because mine are still sick, and I'm starting to wonder if I'm doing something wrong." He looked slightly embarrassed by this admission. "My father-in-law's been telling me I should have culled the whole remaining lot 2 weeks ago and taken the loss. My wife thinks he's right." "What do you think?" Mara said. He looked at her calves for a long time. Several of them were moving toward the feed line now in the slow, deliberate way of animals that are conserving what they have, but still choosing to move toward food. "I think they're still standing," he said, "same as yours." She told him the protocol. She didn't give him a notebook, she needed it. But she walked him through it verbally, the temperature thresholds, the antibiotic choice and timing, the feeding approach, the isolation criteria. She told him about the windbreaks. She told him what she'd noticed about which behavioral cues predicted a downward turn before the temperature numbers caught up. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You're 18, he said. It was not an insult. It was more like an inventory of information he was trying to organize. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "I'll try what you've said." He pushed off the fence. "If it works, I owe you." "If it works, you just know something now," she said. "That's all." After he drove away, she stood at the fence for a moment and looked at her own 63 calves and thought about what it meant that a grown man had driven 8 miles to ask an 18-year-old girl with cracked knuckles and a dollar store notebook what she was doing and whether it worked. She didn't know exactly what it meant. She knew it meant something. She wrote his name in the back of the notebook and the date and left a line under it to fill in later. On Saturday, exactly 1 week since she'd unloaded that trailer in the dark, she moved 12 calves from the main pen to a slightly better pasture area that she'd cleaned up and refenced 2 days before. These were the ones whose temperatures had normalized and who were eating consistently and who she'd assessed as honestly as she could without false hope, as being through the worst of it. The move was a gamble, a small one, based on the theory that calves who'd earned their way to better conditions would respond to them. She knew that wasn't scientifically provable in the moment. She also knew it was what Silas's notes suggested. What Dr. Reyes had implied, and what her own watching of these animals had told her. 2 of the 12 had been among the sickest calves in the lot. One of them was the animal she'd forced to her feet on day 2 by holding its face in both hands and telling it not today. She watched them move into the new pasture area and stand there for a moment in the thin winter sunlight, and then begin to walk carefully, not strongly, but with something that was unmistakably animal intention, moving on their own terms toward something they'd chosen. She didn't say anything. There was nobody there to say anything to. She just watched them for a few minutes and then went back to work. The second week was measurably easier than the first, in the way that things are easier when you know the shape of them. 4 more calves died before the second Monday. Mara had told herself she was prepared for that, and she was approximately prepared for it, which is different. The notebook now had 16 names crossed off the list at the back, 16 ear tag numbers with dates next to them. She'd started saying the numbers out loud in the morning when she wrote them, not for any particular reason, just because it felt like the right thing to do. To say the number plainly, out loud in the cold air, and then move forward, 59 remaining, by the second Monday. Dr. Reyes came back on Monday and walked the pens with Mara for 2 hours, and at the end of it looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite surprise. "These animals look better than I expected," she said. "They look better than I expected too," Mara said. "The ones in the second pen, the ones you moved." Saturday. They'd been running normal temps for 3 days each. Dr. Reyes nodded. She was looking at the group in question, the 12 calves, who were now moving with a steadiness that the main pen animals didn't have yet. They're eating well. Better than well. I've been watching their hay consumption. Those 12 ate almost twice what I expected for their size and condition. "Recovery appetite," the vet said. "It's a good sign." She looked at her own notes. "You've lost 16 total. 59 standing. 59. Out of a lot that every professional buyer at Grafton County walked away from." She paused. "What are you going to do with them?" It was the question Mara had been thinking about for 2 weeks. She had the beginning of an answer. Not the full answer she wasn't ready to say. The full answer out loud yet, because saying it out loud would make it real, and the realness of it required a confidence she hadn't quite arrived at. But the beginning of it was there, written in a yellow notebook, alongside temperature logs and hay consumption figures, and the precise mapped location of a stand of big bluestem on the South 60 that had been growing in the same place since before Silas Whitlock was born. "I'm going to keep them," she said. Dr. Reyes looked at her. "On what?" "The South 60, Mara said. "I'm going to clear it." The vet was quiet for a moment. "That 60 acres hasn't been properly grazed in years." "I know. That's the point." Dr. Reyes seemed to be deciding something. Then she nodded once, in the specific way of someone who doesn't fully understand a plan, but has decided to have enough respect for the person making it to let them make it. "Call me when you've got them ready to move. I'll want to do a final health check before they go on new pasture." She got back in her old truck and drove down the gravel road toward the county highway, and Mara watched her go and then looked back at 59 calves that had survived 7 dead on the first night and 4 more in the second week, and the coldest sustained cold snap in Caldwell County in 11 years. She went inside and opened Silas's 7th journal to the maps in the back and smoothed the pages flat with the heel of her hand. The work ahead of her was very large. The 60 acres was overgrown, the fencing was compromised in 3 sections she'd already identified, and clearing it by hand in the middle of winter, with no equipment budget, was the kind of project that would have made most people recalculate. She knew that. She also knew that the native grasses under that brush had root systems going down 12 feet, that they'd survived drought and neglect and the wrong question for 50 years, and that 59 calves, who'd survived something they weren't supposed to survive, might be exactly the right animals introduced to land that had survived the same thing. Evelyn appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. She looked at the open journal and the yellow notebook side by side on the table, and she didn't say anything for a moment. 59, Mara said. Evelyn was quiet. Then he would have been pleased with 59. Outside, the late afternoon wind had come back up, moving through the bare trees along the fence line with that particular November sound that is mostly made of what's missing. But in the second pasture, 12 calves were eating in the last of the gray light, and the numbers in the yellow notebook were not going down anymore. They were, for the first time, simply staying still. And Mara Whitlock, 18 years old, with cracked knuckles and a borrowed knowledge and a very specific stubbornness that had no name for itself yet, turned the page and kept writing. The decision came to her not as a sudden revelation, but as the only remaining conclusion after everything else had been eliminated. She'd been standing at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, looking at the yellow notebook and Silas's 7th journal, side by side, running numbers in her head that kept arriving at the same problem from different directions. The math of selling the 59 calves now was straightforward and terrible. Stalker calves at their current weight, even recovered, even healthy, which they weren't quite yet, would bring somewhere between $400 and $500 a head at the best regional sale barn she could reach. That was a gross return of maybe $28,000 on the high end, against which she owed Earl Cossett for 2 months of hay, owed Dr. Reyes the balance of the 90-day note, owed the farm supply account she'd opened in October, and would have left herself with a farm that had no cattle, no income stream, no plan, and 60 acres of brush-choked native prairie that would just sit there the same way it had sat there for 20 years. She could sell. She could clear the immediate debts, have maybe $8,000 or $9,000 left over, and be back to where she'd started in September, except with less time and more people watching. She stood there looking at the numbers and understood with the specific clarity that comes from having no good options that selling now was actually the worst thing she could do. Not the riskiest, the worst. The safe choice was the bad choice. The dangerous choice, the one that made Evelyn's jaw tighten when Mara finally told her. The one that Dale Prentice, when she called to check on his calves 2 weeks later, would describe as bold, which is a polite word for what I actually think was to keep them. To put 59 calves that had survived bovine respiratory disease onto 60 acres of overgrown native prairie and ask the land and the animals the question that neither had been asked before: whether they could make each other into something worth more than the sum of what they currently were. Evelyn's reaction was measured in the way that Evelyn's reactions to difficult things were always measured. She didn't argue. She didn't approve. She asked 3 specific questions about feed reserves and fencing and cash flow and listened to the answers with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on Mara's face. When Mara finished, Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You're not asking me," Evelyn said. "No," Mara said. "I'm telling you." Another silence. "Your grandfather made decisions the same way. Told me after the fact most of the time." She paused. "I used to find it infuriating. I know, you've mentioned it. I'm mentioning it again." But there was something in her voice that was not quite objection. It was the sound of a woman who has spent 50 years understanding the difference between a decision she agrees with and a decision she recognizes. The fencing on the South 60 has 3 bad sections. The northwest corner post is rotted through at the base. You can't put cattle on land with compromised fencing. I know about the fencing. Do you have money for materials? No. Then how? I'll do it with what's here, Mara said. There's old cedar post in the barn. Some of it's still good. And there's wire in the second outbuilding that I think is usable. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. You're going to pull and reset fence posts in January. Some of them. The ones that need it. Alone. Unless you want to help. Evelyn made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My hip says no. She picked up her coffee cup and looked into it and then set it down again. What about the brush? The South 60 hasn't been cleared since before your grandfather died. There's brush in there that's been growing for 15 years. I'll clear it by hand. Mara, I'll clear it by hand, she said again, in the flat non-negotiable tone that she'd been developing for most of her life without knowing what it would eventually be used for. It'll take time. I'll do it in sections. I'll clear one section, move a small group of cattle through, let the grazing do part of the work, and clear the next section while the first one rests. Evelyn was quiet. She was looking at the journal, at the maps in the back of the 7th notebook, the ones Silas had drawn with the careful, dense precision of a man who spent a lot of time looking at the same piece of ground from different angles. He always said that land was the best land we had, she said finally. I thought he was being sentimental. He was being accurate, Mara said. The clearing started the second week of January, on a morning so cold that her breath made clouds and the ground rang under her boots like something hollow. She started in the southwest corner, because that's where Silas's maps showed the densest stand of big bluestem, which meant the soil there was almost certainly the best, which meant if she cleared it first, she could get even a small group of cattle on it, while the rest of the work continued. The tools she had were a brush axe, 2 loppers, a bow saw, and a pair of heavy leather gloves that had belonged to Silas, and still fit the shape of his hands rather than hers. The brush was thick, mostly cedar scrub and invasive honeysuckle, and some kind of shrubby thing she couldn't identify that had thorns and a will to live that she grudgingly respected. She worked in 2-hour blocks because after 2 hours her shoulders stopped cooperating and her lower back sent signals she'd learned to take seriously. She took a 30-minute break, drank water even when she didn't want to, ate something even when she wasn't hungry, and went back. The first day she cleared roughly a 1/4 acre. It felt like almost nothing. She stood at the edge of what she'd done at 2 in the afternoon and looked at the pile of cut brush and the exposed ground underneath it and tried to feel encouraged by the sight of dormant native grass stems that had been hidden under that canopy. She found she could feel exactly the size of what remained to be done the other 59 3/4 acres, pressing on the back of her mind like a weather system. She didn't let herself do the arithmetic on how long it would take. That was the kind of arithmetic that stopped people. She went back and cleared another 1/4 acre before dark. The physical toll of the work announced itself in new ways every morning. Her hands, already cracked from the winter cattle work, now had blisters inside the cracks that made putting on the gloves a careful operation. Her shoulders ached through the night in a deep interior way that wasn't the surface burn of overexertion, but the heavier protest of muscles being asked to do something they weren't conditioned for. She shifted her center of gravity differently than thinner people's. The work was harder in specific ways, and she knew it, and she adjusted for it without making it a central fact of her life, the way you adjust for any persistent constraint. There were days when she came in at dark. There were days when she came in at dusk and couldn't straighten her back for 20 minutes and sat in the kitchen chair with her hands on the table, just sitting, while Evelyn moved around the kitchen doing things that didn't require comment. On those evenings, nobody said anything for a long time. Evelyn would put food in front of her eventually, and she would eat it. And then she would go to bed and let her body do whatever it needed to do overnight so she could get up and go back out. She never told Evelyn how much it hurt. Not from pride, exactly, but because saying it out loud would have made it the subject of the evening, and she needed the evenings for the journals and the notebook and the thinking, not for managing someone else's worry about her. She'd been at the clearing for 9 days when the thing happened that she should have anticipated, but hadn't quite. She was working along the eastern fence line, cutting back a run of particularly stubborn honeysuckle that had grown up through the wire and around the posts and was now functionally holding a 10-yard section of fence together by virtue of being entwined with it when she heard a truck slow on the county road. She didn't look up. Trucks slowed on that road sometimes. It was a county road. The truck stopped. She heard a door open and then the sound of boots on gravel, and she looked up and saw Gideon Rusk standing at the roadside fence with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that was somewhere between curious and entertained. He was wearing a good coat and a hat that he probably considered casual. He looked like a man who had driven by something by accident and was deciding whether to make it worth stopping for. "Whitlock," he said. She straightened up, which her back registered as a complaint. She didn't say anything. "You clearing that South 60? What does it look like?" she said. He looked at what she'd done so far, maybe 4 acres, in 9 days of work, which was probably visible from the road as a thin stripe of cleared ground along the fence line. "By hand," he said. "I don't have equipment." He was quiet for a moment. He walked a few steps along the roadside fence, looking at the cleared section. His expression wasn't mocking, exactly. It was something more complicated than that. She'd expected mockery, and she found she didn't know quite what to do with whatever this was instead. "What are you planning to put on it?" he said. "Cattle. Those sick calves you bought. They're not sick anymore." He glanced at her. "How many you end up with?" 59. Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it precisely surprise, maybe, or a recalculation of something he'd assumed. He'd said 70 graves back in November. 59 living was not the outcome he'd been predicting. Native grass, he said, looking at the exposed ground. Big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass in the wetter areas. This land hasn't been properly grazed in 20 years, more or less, she said. I know, that's what I'm working with. He was quiet again. There was something in his silence that felt different from his usual silences, which she'd only experienced twice before, the day of the auction, and once in the parking lot of the feed co-op when they'd nodded at each other without speaking. This silence felt like thinking rather than dismissal. You're going to try to grow those calves out on native prairie, he said. Not a question. That's the plan. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. Then he looked back at the land, at the exposed dormant grass, and he said, it won't work on that timeline. Native grass doesn't produce the way improved pasture does. You won't have enough forage through the growing season to bring those animals to market weight by fall. She knew this. She'd been calculating it for weeks. I'm not trying to bring them to market weight by fall. What are you trying to do by fall? She looked at him steadily. Something different, she said. He seemed to decide that was all he was going to get. He pushed off the fence and turned back toward his truck. Well, he said, it's your money. It wasn't much money, she said. $6. His shoulders tightened slightly. He got in his truck without responding, and she watched him pull back onto the county road and accelerate away. And then she turned back to the honeysuckle and went back to work. Her hands were shaking slightly, though not from the cold. She breathed through it until they stopped. She told Evelyn about the encounter that evening. Evelyn listened without expression and then said, what did he actually want? I don't know. I don't think he knew either. Gideon Rusk always knows what he wants, Evelyn said. He wanted to see if it was real, whether you were actually doing it, or whether you'd given up. Why would he care? Evelyn looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. Because if you actually make something out of that South 60 and those calves, it proves something he's told himself isn't possible. And Gideon has been telling himself that for a long time. The fencing took 3 weeks. Not because it was technically complex. Most of it was stapling wire that was still serviceable back to posts that needed resetting and replacing the rotted northwest corner post with one of the cedar posts from the barn, but because she could only do so much physical work in a day, and the clearing had to continue alongside it. She developed a rhythm that she stuck to with the inflexibility of someone who has learned that rhythm is the only substitute for sufficient resources. 4 hours of clearing in the morning. Lunch. 2 hours of fencing work in the early afternoon. Back to the calves for the late afternoon checks. Dinner. Journals and notebook until 10. Sleep. Evelyn, watching the schedule from the outside, said nothing about it for 2 weeks, and then said, on a Thursday evening in late January, you're losing weight. Mara looked up from the journal. I know. That's not what I'm concerned about. I know that too. You're not eating enough. You're burning more than you're taking in. I'm eating. You're eating enough to keep going, Evelyn said. That's not the same thing. I've watched people work themselves into damage before. Your grandfather did it twice before he learned to pay attention to the body's accounting. Mara put down the pen. She was tired in the way she'd been tired every evening for a month. A tiredness that went past physical and into something that didn't have a clean category. What do you want me to do? Eat more, sleep more. Take 1 morning a week where you do half the work. She paused. The land will still be there if you don't clear it by February 1st. I know. Then act like you know it. Mara looked at her for a moment. The kitchen was warm, and the journals were spread across the table. And outside the window, the South 60 was dark. And she thought about what Silas had written in the 9th journal about patience not as a virtue, not in the sentimental sense, but as a practical technology. Patience as information gathering. Patience as the act of letting the land tell you what it was before you decided what to ask of it. She'd been in too much of a hurry to listen. Not because the urgency wasn't real, it was, but because she'd let urgency become its own kind of blindness. Okay, she said. Evelyn nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who has won a point they've been waiting to make for 3 weeks. She picked up the dish towel she'd set down when she came in and went back to the kitchen, and that was the end of it. February arrived cold, and then turned briefly deceitfully warm in the middle of the month, that false thaw that Missouri does sometimes, and a week of temperatures in the high 40s that makes you think. Spring has decided to show up early and then drops back to February in a single afternoon, as if it changed its mind. During the false thaw, Mara walked the South 60 with Silas's maps and her own notebook and confirmed what the maps predicted and what she'd been hoping to see. The native grass, released from the shade of the brush she'd cleared, was showing green at the base. Not lush, not dramatic, the kind of growth you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But there, the roots were alive. 12-foot root systems that Silas had written about were pushing upward through the warming soil with the patient indifference of things that have been waiting longer than any particular human plan. She crouched down in the cleared section and put her hand flat on the ground, the way she'd seen Evelyn describe Silas doing it, and felt the earth still cold, but not frozen, and underneath the cold, something that might have been the first ambiguous signal of the year turning. She had about 18 acres cleared by the end of February. Not 60, not even close to 60. But 18 acres of exposed native grassland with intact root systems and 3 sections of repaired fence and a water point from a natural seep that Silas's maps had marked and that she'd cleared the brush from so the calves could reach it. 18 acres was enough to start. She moved the first 12 calves, the ones who'd been through the recovery and the second pasture, and were now, by any honest assessment, looking like entirely different animals from what she'd loaded in that trailer in November, onto the South 60 on a Saturday morning in early March. Dr. Reyes had done the final health check the week before and declared them cleared for pasture, and she'd stood at the gate of the second pen and watched Mara make the decision with the quiet expression of someone watching something she doesn't fully understand but is willing to trust. The calves moved on to the South 60, and for a long moment just stood there. That moment always happened. She'd noticed it with the move to the second pen, too. The way animals needed a moment to register that the space had changed, that the terms had shifted. Then the first one dropped its head and began to graze, and the others followed, and that was it. No drama, no ceremony. Just animals making the fundamental animal decision to eat what was in front of them. She leaned on the fence and watched them for a long time. March was where the real gamble became visible. The rest of the calves, the other 47, still on the main pasture, needed feed through the weeks before the South 60, had enough growth to support a larger group, and the hay account with Earl Cossett was now due, and the 90-day balance with Dr. Reyes was coming up at the end of the month, and Mara was sitting on exactly enough money to cover one of those things and not both. She sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday night and looked at the numbers and felt the specific sensation of a plan meeting its first real wall. She called Dale Prentice on Monday morning. He answered on the second ring. His calves, he told her, had come through, mostly intact. He'd lost 4 more after their conversation, which he'd described as gut-wrenching and then immediately characterized as better than it would have been. He had 26 animals he was carrying through the winter, and he was cautiously optimistic in the way that farmers are cautiously optimistic, which means they're saying it carefully because they know better than to say it any other way. "I need to ask you something," Mara said. "Go ahead. I need to defer one of 2 payments this month, the hay account or the vet balance. I'm trying to decide which relationship I can ask for more flexibility from." She paused. "I could also ask for a short-term loan, but I'm not going to do that." A pause on his end. "Why not the loan?" "Because I don't want to owe money that isn't tied to a specific payable thing. The hay and the vet are tied to real value. A loan would just be borrowing against a future I can't guarantee yet." Another pause. "That's a more sophisticated reason than I expected." "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," she said. "It's not sophisticated, it's just what the numbers say." "Which one do you want to defer?" he said. "I don't know yet. I'm gathering information. I'll call Earl and Anita today, and I don't know what I wanted from you exactly. I think I wanted to say it out loud to someone who isn't Evelyn." Dale was quiet for a moment. "How are the calves doing?" "The ones you put on the South 60. They've been on for 3 days. They're grazing. The grass is thin right now, but it's there, and they're finding it. Native grass. Big bluestem mostly in that section." A longer pause. "I've got 12 acres of native grass on the east side of my property that I've been ignoring for about 10 years, he said. "If your animals come off at that South 60 in the fall, looking like what you're saying they're going to look like, I want to know what you know." Deal, she said. What do I call you at that point, a student or a customer? He laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the polite kind. Call me whatever you want. Just call me, she called Earl Cossett first. Earl listened to what she was proposing, a 60-day extension on the hay balance, and was quiet for a moment. You have a plan for the 60 days, he said. Yes. Tell me, she told him. Not everything. She didn't lay out the full vision. The native prairie system, the fall cattle, the things she was trying to build, because Earl was a practical man, and practical men needed practical information. She told him she had 12 calves on native pasture that were growing well, that she had 47 more coming through as soon as the South 60 could support them, that by June she expected to have the complete picture of what the operation was going to look like. June, Earl said. End of June. I'll have a number for you by then. He breathed through his nose. My wife says I give people too many chances. Is she right? Sometimes. A pause. 60 days. If I don't hear from you by May 15th, I'm going to hear from you. You'll hear from me, she said. Dr. Reyes didn't give her the extension. Not because she refused, she didn't refuse. Exactly, but because Mara, after getting off the phone with Earl, sat with the notebook for an hour and did the numbers again, and decided she was going to pay Anita Reyes the full balance by end of month and figure out the difference another way. The vet had taken a risk on 90-day terms for an 18-year-old girl with no track record and 70 sick calves. That was a debt of a different kind, and Mara was going to honor the terms she'd agreed to. She'd find another way through March. The other way turned out to be selling the flatbed trailer. She'd thought about the trailer for 2 weeks before she made the decision. It was old, not worthless, but old, and she'd bought it secondhand 3 years ago for $800 to haul the things that needed hauling around a farm. Without it, hauling anything off-site meant borrowing or renting. With it, she had of its windows were dark. She had a transportation asset that she didn't currently need, because the calves were on the property and staying there. She listed it on a Thursday and sold it on Saturday for $1,100 to a man from 2 counties over who came with cash and drove it away without ceremony. She paid Dr. Reyes the balance the following Monday. Anita Reyes said on the phone, "You didn't have to do this by end of month." "I know," Mara said. "I wanted to. How are you doing out there?" Honestly. Mara thought for a moment. "I'm doing better than I thought I'd be doing, and worse than I'd like to be doing, and the distance between those two things is probably about right for where I am." Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "That's a very accurate answer." "I've been trying to be accurate," Mara said. "It takes more energy than optimism, but it's more useful." April came in wet, which was good. The South 60 was drinking deeply, the native grass, responding to rain and the longer days with a speed that Silas's journals had predicted, and that still surprised her when she walked the cleared sections in the morning. The big bluestem in the southwest corner, the section she'd cleared first, back in that first bitter January week, was already ankle-high by mid-April, which by the standards of improved pasture grasses was unremarkable. Most of its windows were dark, but by the standards of a plant that had been suppressed under brush for 20 years, was something close to a statement. She moved more cattle in the 3rd week of April. Not all of them. She was following Silas's rotation maps, moving animals through sections in the sequence his notes suggested, giving each section rest time before the next group came through. It was slow, and it was counterintuitive, because every instinct of quick return farming said to put all the cattle on all the land and let them graze and then sell. She was doing the opposite. She was grazing lightly and moving early before the cattle could take the grass below the threshold that would stress the root systems. She was letting the grass rest and grow back before the next rotation. The calves, in response to this, were doing something she hadn't fully anticipated, which was growing in a way that didn't look like the growth she was used to seeing in conventional stocker operations. They were filling out slowly, no accelerated grain-driven gain, no dramatic weight-per-day numbers that could be charted on a graph and shown to investors. Just slow, steady, muscle-over growth that was changing the shape of these animals. In a way, she found herself standing at the fence watching on mornings when she should have been doing other things. She was at the fence on one of those mornings in late April, a Friday, thin cloud cover, the South 60 looking greener by the week, when she heard Gideon Rusk's truck on the county road again. She didn't turn around. She heard it slow, and she heard it stop, and she heard the door. He came and stood at the road fence, the way he had in January, except this time he didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at the land, at the cattle moving through it, at the green pushing up in the sections she'd cleared, and the cattle grazing in a way that didn't look like overcrowding, that had space in it, that had something she didn't have a word for except right. It looked right. You rotated them, Gideon said finally. Yes. When did you move them off the southwest corner? 2 weeks ago. They'll go back in about 3 weeks. He was quiet. He had his hands on the fence rail, and he was looking at the southwest corner, which was now showing the most advanced growth, the big blue stem coming up thick and green, the Indian grass threading through it with the distinctive blue-green color that Silas's journals had described and that she'd now seen for herself. My grandfather had native grass on the east quarter of his property, Gideon said. He overgazed it in the 60s, trying to carry too many head, and it never came back. How many did he try to carry? More than it could support. Right, she said. She didn't say anything else. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. She watched a small group of calves. The South 6 to seeds move through the grass with the unhurried, specific purpose of animals that know where the good growth is and are heading toward it. I heard you sold your trailer, he said. She looked at him. Who told you that? Earl Cossett. She made a note to have a mild conversation with Earl Cossett about what was and wasn't everyone's business, and then let it go, because Earl was 71 and had been in this community his whole life, and the information network was older and more established than anything she was going to change. I sold it to cover a balance I owed, she said. You're running thin, Gideon said. It wasn't pity. It was an assessment. I'm running what I have, she said. He looked at her. She met his look without flinching, which required slightly more effort than she wanted it to, because Gideon Rusk was a man who carried himself with the particular authority of someone who has always had enough resources that difficulty was optional. And that kind of authority had a weight to it. How many head you running on the 60, he said. 31 on rotation right now. The other 28 still on the main pasture until I can get the north sections of the 60 cleared. You're still clearing in sections. Yes. He looked back at the land. A long pause. A pair of calves at section, the Nearton section, raised their heads at the same moment, looked at the fence, and then went back to grazing, with the collective indifference of animals who have decided you're not interesting. What are you feeding them as supplement? Gideon said. Nothing. He looked at her sharply. Nothing. Native grass only. Silas's journals document the nutrient profile of this specific mix at this location. The mineral content of the big blue stem and Indian grass in combination with the switchgrass in the low areas covers what conventional supplement is trying to replace. She paused. They're growing without supplement, Gideon. You can see them. He looked at the calves. He couldn't argue what his eyes were telling him, and she could see the specific discomfort of a man whose experience-based certainty was being complicated by evidence he hadn't expected to encounter. You're not going to get market weight by fall, he said. Not grass only without supplement, even with good native grass. I know what they'll weigh by fall, she said. I know it's not commodity weight. That's not the plan. Then what is the plan? She looked at him for a moment. She'd had this answer in her head for months, built from the journals and the notebook and the watching and the numbers and the conversations with Evelyn on winter evenings. She'd never said it out loud to anyone except Evelyn. The plan, she said, is beef that tastes like something. Gideon looked at her blankly. Commodity cattle taste like what you feed them, she said. Grain finished, feedlot finished, it's consistent and it's predictable and it doesn't taste like much. Native grass-finished beef from cattle that were never stressed, that grew slow on the right mix of forages in living soil, it tastes different. The fat profile is different. The flavor is different. She paused. My cousin Caleb runs a restaurant in town. He's been asking me for 6 months what I was going to produce. I told him to wait. Gideon stared at her. She could see him processing it, not the concept, which a man with his experience had probably encountered in some form, but the specific application of it, here, on this land, by this particular person. A restaurant, he said, a small restaurant. Briar Oak Supper House on Clement Street. He's been open for 2 years. I know Briar Oak. He was quiet. He'd take all of it? He'd take what I can give him, which is 2 animals by late fall if everything goes the way I think it's going to go, and more the following year if it does. The wind moved through the South 60. The grass, green and continuing to spread into sections she hadn't even cleared yet, reaching beyond the brush, as if it had been waiting for permission, moved with it, and the calves moved through it. Most of its windows were dark, and Gideon Rusk stood at the road fence and looked at something that wasn't what he'd expected to be looking at when he'd slowed down on a Friday morning on the county road outside a farm he'd written off 11 years ago. 2 animals, he said. That's not a business plan. It's the beginning of one, she said. Everything starts with something small. He didn't respond to that. He stood at the fence for another minute and then walked back to his truck and got in, and she didn't watch him drive away this time. She turned back to the South 60 and started the mental inventory of what the next section of clearing needed, how many days it would take, which group of calves would rotate through it first. Her hand still had old calluses from the winter work, layered over by new ones from the spring. Her back ached on most evenings, differently now, less the protest of unusual demand and more the deep ache of a body that had found its work and was doing it regardless. She had 59 calves that the whole county had decided were graves. She had 60 acres that the county had decided were worthless. She had one cousin with a small restaurant and a deep freezer and a willingness to serve something nobody in this county had been served before. She went back to the fence line and picked up the brush axe and kept clearing, which meant sitting with the gap between where she was, and where she needed to be, and trying not to let that gap become the only thing she could see. She read the journals in the evenings. She walked the cleared sections in the mornings and looked at the grass and the cattle and wrote down what she saw. She talked to Evelyn at dinner about things that were not the farm, about a book Evelyn was reading, about the hawk that had taken up residence in the old cottonwood by the creek, about a memory Evelyn had of Silas in the early years before the operation found its footing, when everything was still uncertain and the outcome was anyone's guess. Was he scared? Mara asked. Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions. He wasn't someone who used that word about himself. Mara looked at her plate, past the point of going back. That's where the real work starts, Evelyn said. Everything before that is still a decision. Everything after it is just the work itself. She'd sold the trailer. She'd deferred the hay balance. She'd asked Dr. Reyes for terms and paid them on time. She was clearing 60 acres with a brush axe and a bow saw and hands that hurt every morning. She was running 59 cattle on native grass without supplement on a rotations system she'd built from an old man's handwritten journals. She was past the point of going back. She'd lay in bed that night and looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the May rain on the roof, and somewhere out there on the South 60, the cattle were sleeping in the wet grass, and she fell asleep before she could finish whatever thought she'd started, which was the first night in 4 months she hadn't stayed awake past 10. The summer arrived the way summers do in that part of Missouri, not gradually, not politely, but all at once. A wall of heat and humidity that hit the first week of June and didn't let up for 3 months. The South 60, fully cleared by the last week of May after one final brutal push through the north sections that left Mara's hands raw, in new places she hadn't known could go raw, responded to the heat the way Silas's journals said it would. The native grasses didn't struggle against summer the way improved pastures did. They moved into it. The big bluestem hit waist height by mid-July. The Indian grass came in thick along the fence lines where the soil was deepest. The switchgrass in the low, wet areas along the natural seep grew in dense blue-green stands that the cattle moved through and came out of looking like they'd eaten something that agreed with them fundamentally. Mara walked the land every morning before the heat built, the way she'd walked it all spring, with the yellow notebook and Silas's 7th journal folded open to the rotation maps. She was on her 3rd notebook by July. The first of its windows were dark. The first 2 were filled with data that had started as necessity and turned into something she found herself returning to for a different reason, not to check the numbers, which she had memorized, but to trace the arc of them, to see in the pages what the land had been in November and what it was becoming now. The cattle were 57 of the original 59. By summer, she'd lost 2 more in the spring, one to a leg injury that hadn't responded to treatment, and one to something she'd never fully diagnosed, a sudden decline over 3 days that Dr. Reyes had investigated and ultimately shrugged at with the professional honesty of someone who knows that not everything has a clean answer. 57 animals on 60 acres of restored native prairie. She thought about those two losses differently than she'd thought about the early ones. The early deaths had felt like failure against a background of uncertainty. These felt like the honest cost of working with living things, which was a distinction she'd needed almost a year to arrive. By August, even Mara could see that the animals were not the same animals that had stepped off that trailer in November. They were not finished cattle, not by conventional measure, not by the weight per day standards that commodity markets ran on. They were lighter than feedlot cattle the same age. But the way they moved was different. The way they carried themselves was different. She'd know its windows were dark. She'd been around cattle long enough to know the difference between an animal that is full and an animal that is well, and what she was looking at on the South 60 was the second thing, in a way she hadn't seen before. Muscle over bone, deep through the shoulder, a brightness in the eye, and a density in the coat that spoke to something working right at a level below the visible. She brought Dr. Reyes out in August for a check, not because anything was wrong, but because she wanted an outside set of eyes on what she was seeing, and because she didn't trust herself not to be seeing what she wanted to see. Dr. Reyes walked the South 60 for an hour without saying much. She examined several animals individually, pulling back lips, checking eyes, feeling along backs and ribs with her hands. She looked at the grass. She looked at the rotation. Markers Mara set up wooden hooks with colored tape and the notebook page that showed the grazing schedule for each section. Finally, she came back to where Mara was standing at the gate and said, "BCS on these animals is better than I expected." "Body condition score," Mara said. "Mid-fives, some of them. Grass only, no supplement, no creep feed. That's not typical. The mineral profile on native prairie grass is different from improved pasture," Mara said. Silas documented it over 40 years. The combination of species in this specific mix. "I know the theory," Dr. Reyes said. "I'm commenting on the evidence." She paused. "What are you doing with them?" "2 animals this fall. My cousin's restaurant." Dr. Reyes looked at the herd. 2 animals. "It's what I can process this year, without debt I can't cover. I'm not borrowing against a product I haven't proven yet. The product looks proven to me. It looks promising," Mara said. "That's different. Promising doesn't pay Earl Cossett." Dr. Reyes made the small sound she made when she found something either funny or accurate. "Which two?" Mara pointed without hesitation. "The steer in the northwest corner of the 3rd section, the red-black crossbred, and the heifer at the south gate, the one with the white patch on her left ear." "You've already decided I decided in June, Doctor." Reyes looked at her with the expression she'd had since that first Monday in November, the recalibrating look. The one that meant her initial estimate of what she was dealing with had turned out to be wrong, and she was adjusting. "I'll do the paperwork for the health certificates when you're ready. Give me 2 weeks' notice." She drove out the same way she'd arrived, down the gravel road, past the section of fence that Mara had rebuilt in January with her own hands, and the cedar posts from the barn, and Mara watched the truck disappear around the tree line and then turned back to the South 60. The decision about the processing had been made in April and refined through May and June. There was a small USDA-inspected facility 40 minutes north in the town of Berker that did custom processing for local producers. She'd called them in April and spoken to a man named Gerald who had operated the facility for 22 years and had a flat, precise way of talking about meat that she found reassuring. He'd given her the per-head cost, the scheduling lead time, the yield estimates for grass-finished animals at the weight she was projecting. She'd done the math on the table that night and sat with it for a long time. 2 animals, grass-finished, at the projected hanging weight, would yield roughly 800 pounds of packaged beef. Caleb's restaurant had a weekly throughput that meant he could move that quantity, and she'd called him and asked specifically 4 to 5 weeks if she was on the menu regularly, and if the product was what she'd been telling him it was going to be. Caleb Whitlock was 29, 5 years older than Mara's oldest memory of him, and he ran Briar Oak Supper House on Clement Street in Caldwell with the particular combination of passion and anxiety that characterized people who have staked something real on something they love. Most of its windows were dark. He'd opened the restaurant 2 years ago after a decade cooking in other people's kitchens. And it was doing the thing that small restaurants do when they're run by someone who actually knows how to cook, surviving by a margin, thin enough to keep him awake at nights, but wide enough that closing wasn't yet the conversation. He had 32 seats and a menu that changed weekly, and a Wednesday night that was reliably full, and a Friday night that was sometimes full, and a weekend that was inconsistent in the way weekends are inconsistent when you're not yet the place people plan their weekend around. She'd told him in December what she was trying to do. He'd been quiet on the phone for a while and then said, "You're talking about native prairie beef. I'm talking about what comes out of this specific land with this specific grass and these specific animals," she'd said. I don't know yet what to call it." "I know what to call it," he'd said. "I just don't know if you can actually produce it. Wait until fall," she'd told him. "Then tell me what you think." She called him on a Tuesday in September to say she was scheduling the processing for the third week of October. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "How many pounds are we talking?" She gave him the estimate. He was quiet again. "That's not a lot," he said. "No," she said, "it's not. I can't build a menu feature around a quantity that runs out in 4 weeks. I know. I'm asking you to try it once. To run it 1 week and see what happens and then tell me what happened. If the feedback is what I think it's going to be, we talk about next year. If it's not, we don't. And next year you'd have how many animals?" "More. I'm already planning the next rotation. The land can carry more now that the grass is established. Next fall, I'm looking at 8 to 10 animals, depending on how the second year of growth goes. 8 to 10 is still a boutique quantity, Mara. I know that. I'm running a restaurant, not a boutique. Caleb." She paused. "Just try it. 1 week. Tell me what the customers say." Another pause. She could hear something in the background, the restaurant sounds. Mid-afternoon, dishes and someone talking, and the specific hollow echo of a dining room between service. "Okay," he said. 1 week. I'll build something around it. But I need the cuts I want, not whatever's left over. I need to talk to your processor. I'll give you Gerald's number," she said. The processing happened on a Thursday, in the third week of October, almost exactly 1 year after she'd bought those calves. Though she didn't register that arithmetic until the drive home from Burker, when it arrived in her head with the low-key quality of a fact that doesn't need to be dramatized to be significant. She drove back on the county highway with the truck empty and the trailer gone and the receipt in her glove compartment, and she thought about the 2 animals she'd pointed out to Dr. Ray's in August, and the care that had gone into them since November, and the 60 acres they'd been part of making into something, and she didn't feel sentimental about it exactly, but she felt the weight of it, the honesty of the transaction. Caleb called her the following Tuesday to confirm delivery. "Thursday morning," he said. "I'm running it Friday night." "Friday," she said. "Friday's when I have the customers who'll actually think about what they're eating. Wednesday's good, but it's habit people. Friday people are there because they made a decision to be there. They pay attention." She didn't go to the restaurant on Friday. She didn't tell Caleb she wasn't coming, and she didn't tell Evelyn she'd considered going, and she spent Friday evening doing the things she would have done anyway. The evening check on the cattle, the notebook entry, the reading, and tried not to think about a restaurant 30 minutes away, where Caleb was serving something she'd built from $6 in a year of work. Evelyn said at dinner, "You should have gone." "I didn't want to be there waiting for a reaction." "That's not a good reason." "It's the reason I have," Mara said. Evelyn looked at her for a moment and didn't push it, which was probably the right call, because Mara was in a mood that wasn't quite nervousness and wasn't quite calm and didn't have a clean name for itself. Caleb called at 9:15 that night. She picked up before the second ring. "We sold out," he said. She said nothing. We sold out by 8 o'clock. I had to pull it off the floor and tell 3 tables we were out. I've never had a cut sell out that fast on a first Friday. A pause. "Mara, tell me what they said," she said. What they said. She could hear him moving in the kitchen. The restaurant was probably empty now. The end of service sounds, someone running water. "One guy, he's a regular, comes in every other Friday, very specific about his food. He called me over and asked where the beef was from." I told him. "He asked if we'd be carrying it again." I said, "Up so," he said. "And this is him, not me," he said. "That's the best piece of beef I've eaten in this state in 20 years. Those were his words. Mara sat down at the kitchen table. She hadn't realized she'd been standing. "One woman sent me a note through the server," Caleb continued, "written on a napkin. She asked if she could speak with whoever raised the animals. I told her the farmer was a young woman from Caldwell County. She seemed surprised. I'll bet she did. A couple at the corner table, first time at Briar Oak. I'd never seen them before. They asked if we had more for purchase. like retail. I told them we didn't, but I took their name. A beat. I have 6 names. She looked at the yellow notebook on the table. The third one almost full now. 6 names from one Friday. 6 people who want to know when more is available. Not if when. He paused. I don't know what you did out there, Mara. I've cooked grass-finished beef before. It wasn't this. Whatever the combination is, the specific grass, the animals. The time it's something different. She sat at the table for a long time after she hung up. The house was quiet. Evelyn had gone to bed before 9, and the kitchen was still except for the refrigerator cycling on and then off. Through the window, the South 60 was completely dark, as it always was at night, as it had been all year, and somewhere out there in the October dark, the remaining 55 animals were resting in the grass that she and they had made together out of something nobody had wanted. She opened the notebook and wrote the date, and Caleb's words sold out by 8. Best piece of beef in 20 years, 6 names, and then she put the pen down and just sat there for a while, not writing, not thinking about the next step, just letting the moment exist at its actual size before the planning started again. The planning started the next morning. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when Mara came down at 5, which was unusual. Evelyn was a 7 o'clock person, had been since her hip made early mornings something to negotiate rather than take for granted. She had her own coffee, and Silas's 9th journal open in front of her, and an expression that said she'd been up for a while. Caleb called me, Evelyn said. When? Last night. After he called you. She looked at the journal. He was excited. He's not usually excitable. He had reason. Evelyn looked at her with the expression that had been accumulating all year, the one that was past the point of measuring, and into something older and less conditional. Yes, she said, he did. Mara poured her coffee and sat across from the journal. I need to talk to you about next year. I thought we might. I want to run more animals. The land can support it. If I'm careful about the rotation not significantly more, I don't want to push the grass before the root system is fully reestablished. But 8 to 10 head instead of 2 for processing would change the math considerably. Evelyn listened. She asked the same 3 questions she'd asked in December when Mara had first laid out the planned feed reserves, fencing, cash flow, and the answers this time were different. Not easy, but different in the way that answers are different when you've spent a year building the foundation they're standing on. You'll need to buy calves again, Evelyn said. This spring. Yes. Are you buying sick ones again? Mara considered the question. It was an honest question and deserved an honest answer. If that's where the margin is, yes. But I'd rather buy calves that aren't sick, that I can bring onto the native grass without the loss period. The first year cost me 11 animals. I'd rather not repeat that. You may not have the money to buy healthy ones. I know. I'll look at what's available in February and make the call then. She paused. I've also been thinking about Dale Prentice. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. He has 12 acres of native grass he's been ignoring. He's been watching what I've done here. I think if I approached it right, he might be interested in something collaborative. Not partnership necessarily. More like I provide the system, the knowledge, the rotation protocol, and he provides additional grazing capacity when I need it. You'd be teaching him. I'd be sharing what Silas figured out. That's different from teaching. Evelyn looked at the 9th journal. Silas would have liked that distinction, she said. The word about Briar Oak Supper House spread the way things spread in a county the size of Caldwell, not through any deliberate effort, but through the specific social architecture of small communities where 6 people who had a remarkable meal on a Friday night each tell 3 other people by Monday morning, and by the following Friday, Caleb had a wait list for the 2 tables nearest the window that he'd designated somewhat arbitrarily as the best seats in the house. He called Mara on the following Wednesday. I need more, he said. Not next year. I need to know if you have anything available this fall. I have 2 more animals I could process before December, she said. She'd been thinking about this since Saturday morning. Borderline, they're not quite where I'd want them, ideally. But they're close. How close is borderline? 90% of what you served Friday. Maybe 95. A pause. That's fine. That's still better than anything else I'm serving. Another pause. There's something else. I had a conversation on Saturday with a man named Fletcher Odom. He runs a group called Ozark Table. It's a sourcing collective, basically. They supply about 8 or 9 restaurants in the region with local and specialty proteins. He heard about Friday from one of my regulars, and he came in Saturday, and I gave him a taste of what was left from the prep. She could hear Caleb choosing his words carefully. He wants to talk to you. Mara set down her coffee. About what? About whether you can scale. About whether what you're doing is replicable at a volume that would be useful to the collective. She was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him I'd pass on his number. That's all. A beat. I didn't make any commitments. I know this is your thing, not mine. What's your read on him? He's legitimate. He's been operating the collective for 8 years. He's not looking to extract, or at least he's good at not looking like it. He seemed genuinely interested in the product, not just the story. Another pause. But I don't know, Mara. It's your call entirely. She wrote Fletcher Odom's name in the notebook and his number underneath it, and looked at both for a long moment. I'll call him, she said, but not yet. When I know what I can actually offer him. I'm not going into that conversation without numbers. She spent 3 evenings that week running projections, not guesses, not optimistic scenarios, but actual numbers based on what the South 60 had produced in its first full year of restored grazing, cross-referenced against Silas's records of the land's historical productivity before the overgrazing and neglect. The calculation she arrived at was conservative, and she made it even coercive, and she made it even more conservative by cutting the high-end estimate by 15%. Because she'd learned the hard way, in the first week of November the previous year, that the gap between what you hope for and what you get is always more expensive than you budget for. The number she arrived at was this. If she ran the operation correctly over the next 2 years, careful rotation, continued grass establishment, selective buying of new calves, each spring she could sustainably process 12 to 15 animals per year by year 3 without degrading the prairie. 12 to 15 animals at the yield and quality she demonstrated was a supply that would be meaningful to a small collective but not overwhelm her capacity to manage it with the resources she had. She called Fletcher Odom on a Thursday morning from the kitchen table with the notebook open and Silas's maps beside it. He was not what she'd expected, which meant she'd expected something specific and wrong. She'd expected the voice of a salesman or an aggregator smooth, fast, understand in the concept rather than the specifics. What she got instead was a man who asked very precise questions and listened to the answers completely before asking the next one. He was maybe 50. She guessed from his voice and had been working with small producers long enough to have lost patience with the kind of enthusiasm that didn't translate into reliable supply. Tell me about the land, he said, after the opening pleasantries were done with in about 30 seconds. She told him. She told him about the native grass composition, the rotation system, the soil history that Silas's journals documented, the restoration work she'd done, the supplement-free approach, and why the mineral profile supported it. She spoke for about 8 minutes without stopping, and when she was done, Fletcher Odom was quiet for a moment. You have documentation on the grass species and the rotation, he said. I have my great-grandfather's journals from 1971 to 2001 and my own records from the past year. I can give you whatever you need. I'd want to see the property. You can see it any time, she said. I'd want to meet you in person before we talk about any arrangement. Fair enough. A pause. The restaurants I work with are looking for something consistent. Not in the sense of industrial consistency, they know better than to expect that from small producers, but consistent in the sense that when they put something on the menu, they can rely on it being there. Can you make that commitment at the volume you're describing? At 12 to 15 animals per year, yes. That's a number I can stand behind. Anything larger than that, not yet. Not yet, he repeated, meaning the capacity might grow. The capacity will grow if I manage the land correctly. I'm not going to promise a supply that requires me to degrade the thing that makes the supply worth anything. Another pause. This one felt like a different kind of thinking. Who taught you this system? My great-grandfather. Through his journals. He died before I was old enough to work with him directly. And you're how old are you now? 19, she said. She'd had a birthday in August, which she'd mostly forgotten about, until Evelyn put a single candle in a piece of cornbread at dinner and told her to make a wish, and she'd said she didn't believe in wishes, and Evelyn had said make one anyway, so she had. Fletcher Odom was quiet for a long time. I'd like to come see the property next week, he said. If that works. Thursday works. she said. He came on a Thursday in early November, almost exactly 1 year to the day since she'd unloaded that trailer in the dark, and she walked him across the South, 60 for 2 hours in the cold morning air. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with gray at his temples and good boots, and the quiet, observant manner of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors looking at things. He didn't talk much while they walked. He crouched down twice to look at the grass. He looked at the rotation markers. He watched the cattle for a long time from the fence of the section that currently held the largest group. When they got back to the gate, he stood for a moment, looking back at the land. "How many acres of this is fully restored?" he said. 53. "I'm still working on the northeast corner. There's a section of particularly stubborn cedar scrub. I'll finish it by spring. And you're planning to buy new calves this spring, February or March, depending on what's available. What are you looking for?" Same as last year, honestly. Animals with something left in them that the market hasn't recognized. I'm not above another bad lot if the price makes the math work. She paused. Healthy would be better. But I'll work with what the arithmetic gives me. He looked at her. How much did you pay for the original lot? $6, she said, for all 70. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but in that direction. I heard that. I thought it was an exaggeration. No. He looked at the South 60 once more. The November light was thin and level, and it caught the seed heads of the big bluestem, the ones that hadn't been grazed, in the resting sections, and made them copper-colored and tall, 12 feet of root system, anchoring each one in soil that nobody had believed was worth the trouble. I want to work with you, he said. Not immediately. I want if its year goes. I want to see how next year goes. I want to see your spring calves and your summer grazing and your fall animals before I make any commitment to the collective. But I'm telling you now that if the operation is what today suggests it is, I want to work with you. She nodded. That's the arrangement I'd want. No contract yet. No contract yet, she agreed. Both of us watching and then deciding. He drove away in a truck that was nicer than hers, and she stood at the gate and watched it go. And then Shane turned back to the South 60 and did what she always did, started the mental inventory of what the next thing was. The next thing, that particular Thursday, was a visit from Gideon Rusk. She didn't know he was coming. She heard his truck on the county road at around 11 and recognized the engine sound. She'd heard it often enough by now, and watched him pull into the driveway with the particular body language of a man who has decided something and has come to say it. He got out of the truck and looked at the South 60 the way he'd been looking at it all year, through all the stages, brush and January cold, then the first green in March, then the summer growth, then the fall cattle moving through it. He'd driven past it probably 24 times. This was the first time he'd pulled into the driveway. "You had a man from a restaurant collective here this morning," he said. She looked at him. "You were watching. I was driving past. I recognized the truck. I've done business with Fletcher Odom." He paused. "He works with serious producers." "I know. You're 19. I know that too." He looked at the land. The November light was still doing the thing with the seed heads, and Gideon Rusk stood in her driveway and looked at it with an expression that was finally, after a full year, something other than skepticism or amusement. It was the expression of a man doing an accounting. "I've got 40 acres on the east side of my property," he said. "East boundary along the creek. It's been running thin for 3 years. So I've been supplementing the cattle that graze it just to keep them at weight, and the land isn't responding to it the way it should." He was still looking at the South 60, not at her. "I think the problem is what I'm doing to it, not what the land is." She said nothing. She waited. "I want to know if you'd be willing to look at it," he said, "to give me your honest assessment. I'll pay you for your time." She looked at him for a moment. Gideon Rusk, 600 head of cattle, biggest operation in the county, standing in her driveway with his hat in his hands, not literally, but functionally, asking the girl he'd called a purchase of 70 graves to tell him what was wrong with his land. "I don't want your money," she said. He looked at her then. "Then what do you want?" She thought for a moment. "I want you to understand why you're asking me. Not the land problem, I can look at the land. But I want you to understand what changed for you between November of last year and today." He was quiet. He seemed to find the question uncomfortable in the way that honest questions are uncomfortable for people who aren't accustomed to being asked them. "What changed," he said, "is that you did something I didn't think you could do. Because of the land?" "Because of you," he said. Because of all of it. The calves nobody wanted, the journals, the clearing, the grass, the restaurant. Because Caleb Whitlock sold out on a Friday night and 6 people left their names. He paused. Because I was wrong. The wind moved through the big blue stem seed heads with that dry, whispering sound that native grass makes in November, the sound of something that has survived longer than the people watching it. I'll look at your land, she said, next week. He nodded once. He seemed to want to say something else, and then decided against it and got back in his truck, and she watched him drive out to the county road and turn north toward the larger operation that 600 head of cattle required and that 40 acres of east pasture was beginning to trouble. She went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her back to the door, and when Mara came in, she didn't turn around. I heard, Evelyn said. How much? She turned. Her face was doing the complicated thing it did when she was feeling something she didn't have easy words for. Gideon Rusk asking for your help. He didn't exactly ask. He described a problem. Same thing for Gideon. She paused. Your grandfather would have. She stopped herself. What? Mara said. Evelyn looked at the table where the yellow notebooks sat in a stack next to Silas's journals, the old and the new side by side, the records of the same land, separated by 40 years, and then rejoined by a girl who'd paid $6 for a chance and the work that came after it. He would have been very quiet about it, Evelyn said, and very pleased. Mara sat down at the table. She opened the third notebook to the next blank page and wrote the date. She wrote Fletcher Odom's name and the word Thursday, and then the words watching, and then deciding. She wrote Gideon Rusk's name and next week and east pasture 40 acres. She thought about the numbers for next spring, the calves she'd need to buy, the rotation adjustments the second-year grass establishment would require, the conversation with Dale Prentice she'd been planning since April, the conversation with Fletcher Odom that would happen sometime in the fall of next year if the summer went the way the data suggested it would go. She thought about the man at Caleb's restaurant who'd written on a napkin, the mostad who'd asked to speak with whoever's raised the animals and seemed surprised to hear which was a young woman from Caldwell County. She thought about 70 calves in a muddy stockyard pen, coughing, heads down, too sick for anyone to want. She thought about the $6 in her hand and Gideon Rusk's voice carrying across the auction barn and the laughter that had followed it, and how she'd stood there and not said a word back, and turned and walked to the window to pay. Outside, the South 60 was moving in the November wind, the restored prairie doing what restored prairies do in the fall, going dormant without dying, pulling the year's growth back down into those 12-foot root systems to wait for spring, holding everything it had made through the summer in the dark earth, where nobody could see it and where it would still be in March when the ground warmed and the question started over. Mara wrote in the notebook until the light changed and the kitchen got cold and she got up to start the afternoon checks. There was a steer in the third section of the South 61 of the originals, a dark red crossbred with a notch in his left ear from a fence wire incident in February, that she'd named in her head. Against all the practical wisdom she'd absorbed about the dangers of naming animals you might eventually have to sell. She'd never said the name out loud to anyone, not even Evelyn, because saying it out loud would have made it too real. Most of its windows were dark, but she'd been calling him something in her own head since January, since the morning she'd found him standing in the corner of the recovery pen, looking at the dead animals around him with that specific, stubborn aliveness she'd recognized from the auction barn. She still wasn't going to say the name out loud. But when she came through the gate of the third section for the afternoon check, and he raised his head and looked at her with the calm, measuring gaze of an animal that has decided she's there, she looked back at him for a moment before she started the count. That was enough. That had always been enough. She started the count the way she did every afternoon, writing each number in the notebook in her cramped, practical handwriting, the same handwriting she'd had since she was 12 years old, and Evelyn had made her keep a feed journal as a way of learning to be precise about things that mattered. 57 animals. 57 animals on 60 acres of land that everyone had told her was worthless, standing in grass that everyone had told her wasn't there. She finished the count. She closed the notebook. She walked back through the gate and latched it behind her and went on to the next thing. Gideon Rusk's east pasture was worse than he'd described it. Mara walked it on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November with her notebook and Silas's maps, not because Silas had ever walked Gideon's land, but because the soil types in this part of the county shared enough characteristics that the maps were useful as a reference point, a way of knowing what to look for and where. What she found in the first 20 minutes told her most of what she needed to know. The grass was thin and pale in the way that overworked ground goes thin and pale, not from drought, not from disease, but from a simple and sustained failure to ask the land less than it could give. The root systems she could feel through the soil with her boot heel were shallow. Most of its windows were dark. The native species that should have been there, because the creek bed along the eastern boundary was exactly the kind of riparian environment that supported diverse native grass communities, were mostly gone, crowded out by fescue that Gideon or his father had probably seeded decades ago, because fescue was reliable, and reliability had seemed like the whole point. Gideon walked behind her, and to the right, which was the posture of a man who had made himself come to a thing he found uncomfortable. He didn't say much. She appreciated that. She didn't need commentary while she was reading land. At the far eastern edge, where the creek ran shallow over limestone shelf, she stopped and crouched and looked at the bank. There was big bluestem growing there, not much a stand, maybe 6 feet wide, crowded to the water's edge by the fesco that had colonized everything above the floodline, but it was there. Real and alive, seed heads still on in November, roots going down into the creek bank in the way native grass roots do when they've found water and decided to stay. "You see this?" she said. Gideon came and stood beside her. Native grass. It survived here because the fescue can't compete at the waterline. The flooding protects it. She straightened up, which means the native seed bank in this soil isn't dead. It's suppressed. That's different. How different? Different the way 6 is different from dead, she said. She heard her own voice saying it and thought about November of the previous year, about 67 calves in a quarantine pen, about the specific and costly distinction between those two things. You can work with sick. You can't work with dead. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bluestem stand and then at the fescue that surrounded it, and then at the 40 acres behind them, thin and pale in the November light. "What would you do," he said, "if this were your land?" She thought about how to say it in a way he'd actually hear. "I'd stop asking it to carry what it's been carrying. I'd pull the cattle off this section for a full season. I'd cut the fescue back in the worst sections and give the native seed bank room to respond. And I'd be patient about what I expected the first year back. A full season off production. Yes." He looked at the 40 acres. She could see him doing the arithmetic 600 head operation. 40 acres pulled from rotation for a year, the cost of that in hay and supplement to compensate. It was a real cost, and she didn't pretend it wasn't. "If you do it right," she said, "by year 2, you're looking at land that can carry more animals at better condition on less supplement than you're currently running. The math works. It just doesn't work in the first year." "You sound like you're describing your own South 60. "I'm describing what the land told me," she said, "on the South 60, and right here, standing at this creek. It's the same conversation." He was silent for a long time. A kingfisher shot past them over the water, low and fast, and disappeared around the bend. "I called you a purchase of 70 graves," he said. It came out without preamble, without the softening language that people usually wrap apologies in when they're not entirely sure they want to give one. She looked at him. "Yes. I said it loud enough for most of the barn to hear. You did." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands, a gesture she'd never seen from him before. A nervous gesture, humanizing in a way that was slightly startling. "I've been running cattle in this county for 30 years. I thought I knew what was going to happen to those calves." "You knew what usually happens," she said. "Usually is most of the time. It's not all of it." He looked at her for a moment. "I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You were making a reasonable prediction from the information you had. It turned out to be wrong." She paused. "What you could do if you wanted to do something is tell people what you saw, not the apology part. Just what you saw here and what you saw on the South 60. That's worth more than an apology." He was quiet for a long time. The creek moved past them, slow and cold. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." They walked back to the gate, and she told him what she'd need to see through the spring before she could give him a full protocol soil samples from the depleted sections, a complete picture of his current rotation schedule, information about what he'd been supplementing and at what levels. Most of its windows were dark. He listened without interrupting and wrote things down in a small notebook she hadn't known he carried. When she got home, Evelyn was sitting in the front room with the newspaper, which she still got delivered, a habit she'd maintained since Mara was a child, and that Mara associated with a particular sound, the paper unfolding in the morning. She looked up when Mara came in. "How bad is it?" Evelyn said. "Manageable. He'll need a full season off production on the east section. He won't like the cost of that. He'll do it anyway," Evelyn said. "He drove to your farm and asked for help. That was the hard part for Gideon. Everything after that is just work." She was right, as it turned out. The second year of the Whitlock operation began in February with the purchase of 14 calves from a producer 2 counties south, who was downsizing his herd voluntarily rather than through crisis. These animals were not the desperate purchase of the first year they were weaned, vaccinated, reasonably healthy, and cost significantly more per head than $6. Mara had been saving since July with the specific discipline of someone who had learned that the gap between what you need and what you can spend is always smaller if you start saving earlier than feels necessary. She paid for them with money she had, which was a different feeling from paying with the last money she had, though the arithmetic was tight enough that the difference was more psychological than financial. Evelyn stood at the gate when the new calves arrived and watched them come off the trailer with a steadiness in her face that Mara had been watching all year, a steadiness that was not complacency, but the kind of earned calm that comes from having watched enough outcomes arrive. "Better looking than the first batch," she said. "Lower degree of difficulty," Mara said. "Don't let it make you soft," Evelyn said, which made Mara laugh, a real laugh, the involuntary kind, and Evelyn smiled at the sound of it in the way people smile when they've been waiting for something to return. Dale Prentice came in March, as she'd expected. He pulled in to the driveway on a Thursday morning, with his hat on and his hands in his pockets and the slightly sheepish look of a man who has come to make good on something he said 6 months ago. His 12 acres of native grass on the east side of his property had, over the winter, been cleared of the invasive scrub he'd been letting grow at the edges for a decade, and he'd done it himself, by hand, based on what she'd told him. "I probably did half of it wrong," he said, standing at her fence, looking at the South 60. "Show me the maps and I'll tell you," she said. He unfolded a hand-drawn sketch from his jacket pocket, done in pencil on graph paper, the kind of map a person makes when they've been paying attention to the same piece of ground for a long time and have started to understand it differently. She looked at it for a while without speaking. "This drainage here," she said, pointing to a line he'd marked along the south edge of his native section. "Is that a seasonal wet area or year-round?" "Seasonal. Wet from February through May, dry by June. Switchgrass will come in there on its own if you let it. Don't try to seed it, just leave the ground open and the existing seed bank will do the work." She handed the map back. "The rest of what you've done looks right. You can put animals on it by June if you're careful about stocking rate." He folded the map back up. "What's careful?" She told him the numbers animals per acre, rotation interval, the specific behavioral cues in the cattle that told her when to move them before the grass was overstressed. She told him about the yellow notebook and the twice-daily observations that felt excessive until the day they weren't, and about the value of writing things down not just as record-keeping, but as the act of paying attention made physical. He listened the way he'd listened in January of the previous year completely, without rushing her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're giving me all of this," he said. "Yes." "What do you want for it?" She thought about what she'd told Gideon Rusk. "Tell people what works," she said. "That's all. When your animals come off that 12 acres in the fall looking different from what they looked like going in, tell people why." He looked at her for a moment. He was 36 years old and had been farming since he was old enough to drive a tractor, and he had the face of someone who has spent a lot of time outside looking at things and trying to understand them, and something in that face shifted. "My father-in-law still thinks I should have culled the whole sick lot last winter," he said. "He brings it up about once a month." "What you say?" "I say 26 animals that are standing beat 11 that are gone. He thinks that's sentimental." "It's not sentimental," she said. "It's arithmetic." He smiled at that, a small, real smile. "That's what I'll tell him next time." The spring of the second year was different from the first in ways that were difficult to articulate to anyone who hadn't lived through the first. The work was the same: work clearing, fencing, water management, rotation, morning checks, notebook, but the quality of it had changed. Not easier, not lighter, but more legible. She understood what the land was telling her now, in the way you understand a language you've been speaking for a year. Not fluently, not without error, but with enough competence that the meaning came through without having to labor over every sentence. Fletcher Odom came in June, as he'd said he would. He spent a full day at the farm, longer than his November visit, and this time he brought two of the chefs he worked with, a woman named Sasha, who ran a restaurant in Kansas City, and a man named Leon, who cooked out of a place in St. Louis that had been mentioned in a regional food magazine that Caleb had shown Mara over the winter. Both of them were quiet people who looked at things carefully and asked specific questions. Sasha crouched down in the southwest section of the South 60 and looked at the grass, the same way Mara had crouched at Gideon's Creek bank and looked at the blue stem with the attention of someone trying to understand what they were tasting before they tasted it. "This is the grass that was in the beef," Sasha said, not really asking. "That section's in the rotation right now," Mara said. "The current animals won't go on it for another 3 weeks." Sasha stood and looked at the cattle in the adjacent section. She watched them for a while. She seemed to be making some kind of calculation that had nothing to do with the numbers Mara could see. "The fat profile is different," she said. "Not just richer different. More complex. I've served other grass-finished beef, and it doesn't taste like this." "Different grass," Mara said simply. "Different soil. Different time." "How long to full restorations on this land?" "I'd say we're 3 to 4 years out from the point where the fruit systems are fully reestablished across the whole 60.
We're running well on the cleared sections, but the northeast corner is still catching up."
Sasha looked at Fletcher. Something passed between them that was the shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to have a language below language. "We want a long-term arrangement," Fletcher said to Mara. "Both Sasha's restaurant and Leon's, plus 2 others in the collective. Total ask is roughly 18 to 20 animals per year by year 3. You told me you could get to 12 to 15. What would it take to get to 20? Mara had been waiting for this question since November. She had some of its one-twos dark. She had the answer in the notebook, worked out over 3 evenings in April with the rotation maps and the yield data and the soil sample results she'd gotten back from the extension office in February. Collaboration with at least one neighboring producer running the same system, she said. "I've been working with Dale Prentice on 12 acres of native grass about 8 miles east, and I've started a protocol assessment on 40 acres of Gideon Rusk's east pasture that will be ready for limited grazing by year 2 if the restoration goes well." She paused. "If both of those operations come fully online and follow the same grass management protocol, the combined supply gets you to the number you're asking for." Fletcher was quiet. "You're building a network. I'm sharing a system," she said. "It was never mine to begin with. My great-grandfather figured it out on this land 40 years ago and wrote it all down, and nobody read it until I did. If sharing it means the land around here gets treated differently, that's a better outcome than keeping it proprietary." Leon, who had said almost nothing all day, spoke for the first time. "What do you want out of this arrangement?" The directness of the question was refreshing. "Fair price for a differentiated product," she said. "Not commodity pricing. The animals I'm producing are not commodity animals, and I won't sell them at commodity prices. I want a pricing structure that reflects the cost of doing this correctly, the rotation time, the recovery period, the no-supplement approach. If that doesn't work for the collective, we don't have a deal." Fletcher looked at her. "I've never had a producer 19 years old tell me those terms." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's actually the first time in about 4 years a producer has given me terms instead of asking what I was willing to pay." He paused. "I respect it. We'll work out the numbers." They worked out the numbers over the following 2 weeks in a series of phone calls that Mara treated with the same rigor she brought to the rotation schedule: precise, documented, not rushed. She had Evelyn read the draft agreement before she signed it, because Evelyn had managed farm accounts for 50 years and could read a contract the way she read a balance sheet, looking for the places where the language gave more than intended or took more than it appeared to. "This clause here," Evelyn said, pointing to a paragraph about exclusivity. You're agreeing not to sell to any restaurant, not affiliated with the collective, for 2 years. I know. Is Caleb affiliated? Mara had thought about this. I asked Fletcher. He said Briar Oak can be designated as a collective partner at no cost to Caleb. The exclusivity clause doesn't touch him. Evelyn read the clause again. But what about direct sales? The 6 people who left their names with Caleb that first Friday. Mara had thought about that too. The clause covers restaurants only. Direct farm sales aren't restricted. Evelyn looked at the clause once more. All right, she said. She handed the pages back. Your grandfather would have had a lawyer look at it. I don't have money for a lawyer. I know, I'm noting it for the record. She paused. The terms are otherwise sound. Mara signed the agreement on a Thursday in late July, which happened to be a day when the South 60 was in one of its peak periods, the big blue stem at its summer height, the cattle in the third section moving through it with the unhurried, purposeful quality she had come to understand as a sign that everything was working the way it was supposed to work. She sat at the kitchen table with the signed pages in front of her and looked out the window at the land for a while, before she put the pages in the envelope. She thought about Silas. She thought about the 9th journal and the line she'd read 50 times, by now, a pasture doesn't fail. It answers what you ask of it. And she thought about how it had taken 40 years and one dead man's careful writing and one 18-year-old girl with $6 to ask the right question. She thought about the auction barn, about the laughter, about Gideon's voice carrying across the room. She didn't feel vindicated exactly. Vindication was something you felt toward people, and what she felt wasn't about people. It was about the land and the grass and the calves that had survived and the ones that hadn't, and the specific, unromantic truth that the world didn't rearrange itself in response to other people's contempt. It rearranged itself in response to what you did. Or it didn't rearrange at all, and then you figured out why and tried again. She put the envelope in the truck and drove to the post office. The autumn of the second year brought the first real test of the collective arrangement, 8 animals processed. The highest single-season number she'd run, requiring a coordination with Gerald at the Berker facility that was more logistically complex than the 2-animal operation of the previous fall. She managed it with the yellow notebook and a wall calendar that she'd written every step on in black marker, the kind of calendar organization that looks excessive until the moment it isn't, and she got through October without a significant error. The yields were better than projected. The animals came off the South 60 at condition scores that made Gerald, who was not an expressive man, say, "These are good cattle," in a tone that meant more than it appeared to. Caleb served the beef on 3 consecutive Fridays in October and sold out all 3 times. The waitlist for Friday reservations at Briar Oak Supper House, which had never existed before, was now running 2 weeks deep. He called her after the 3rd Friday and said, "I have a food writer coming next month from a regional magazine." She heard about the beef. "What did you tell her?" Mara said. "I told her the story, as much as I knew of it." "Don't tell her about the $6, she said. A pause. "Why not?" She thought about it. "Because I don't want that to be the story. The $6 is where it started. It's not what it is." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What do you want the story to be?" She looked out the kitchen window at the South 60 in late October, going dormant again, pulling itself back down into the roots for winter the same way it had done last year and the year before, and every year, for decades before, she'd cleared the brush off it, storing everything, waiting, knowing, in the way that living systems know things, that spring was a fixed appointment. "Tell her about the grass," Mara said. The food writer came in November. Her name was Petra, and she was in her 30s and had the particular energy of someone who has written about food long enough to be tired of writing about food and is looking for something that reminds her why it mattered. She walked the South 60 with Mara for an hour and a half in the cold and asked questions that were better than Mara had expected, not about the romance of farming, not about the back-to-the-land narrative that people often wanted to project onto what she was doing, but about the specific decisions. Why this rotation interval? Why no supplement? What the journals had said and how she'd verified it against what she was seeing in the land. Mara answered all of it directly, without performance, in the same tone she used with Fletcher and with Dale and with Doctor. Ray is the tone of someone describing what they'd observed and what they'd concluded from it and where they were still uncertain. At the end of the walk, Petra stood at the south gate and looked back at the 60 acres and said, "How old were you when you started this?" 18, Mara said. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" Mara thought about Evelyn's answer to the same question about Silas. He wasn't someone who used that word about himself. "But I think yes. I was past the point where being scared was useful," she said, "so I just did the work." The article ran in February of the following year in a regional food and agriculture magazine that had a distribution Mara hadn't anticipated. It was not a long article, 4 pages, a photograph of the South 60 in winter that the photographer had spent 3 hours getting right, and that looked, honestly, like nothing special until you'd walked that ground and understood what winter meant to native prairie. But it was precise, in the way good writing about complicated things is precise, which is to say it didn't simplify the complexity or inflate the feeling. It told the truth about what the land was and what she'd done to it and what had come out of it. The response was not immediate or dramatic. It was more like the way native grass comes back visible only in retrospect. The accumulation of small things that don't look like much individually, until one morning you walk out and see that the ground is green. Phone calls came in over the following weeks. 2 producers from adjacent counties, both of whom had land they described in language that Mara recognized thin, not responding, worth less than it used to be. A man who ran a small restaurant in a town she'd never heard of asked him about purchasing protocols. A woman's of its windows were dark, a woman from the university extension office who wanted to know if Mara would be willing to talk to a group of agriculture students about native grass restoration. She said yes to the extension office invitation after thinking about it for a day. She said yes to the producers and told them to come walk their land with her, and she'd tell them what she saw. She said yes to the restaurant and quoted the collective pricing structure and told him to call Fletcher Odom. She said all of it in the same tone she'd been using for a year and a half, direct, specific, not inflated. The tone of someone who has learned things she didn't know before and is willing to say what they are. Evelyn read the article 3 times. Mara knew because she came into the kitchen on 3 separate evenings and found it on the table with the pages slightly rearranged, the way they get when someone keeps picking them up and setting them down. She didn't say anything about it to Evelyn. Evelyn didn't say anything about it to her. That was the right way to handle it, she thought. Some things were better honored by silence than by description. The thing that broke the silence was smaller and more unexpected than anything the article had generated. It was a Tuesday in late March, early spring, the kind of day where the temperature says 45. But the sun is finally at the angle where you can feel it, where you can feel the year turning. Mara's of its windows were dark. Mara was in the South 60, checking on the new growth. The second-year grass was coming in earlier and stronger than the first year, which was what the journals had predicted, and what still, even knowing it would happen, stopped her each time she saw it. She was crouched down looking at the base of a big blue steam stand in the southwest corner when she heard Evelyn calling her name from the direction of the house. The tone of it brought her upright immediately. She came back through the gate and across the yard at a pace that was close to running without quite being running, and found Evelyn sitting in the chair by the kitchen window, not lying down, not collapsed, just sitting, but sitting wrong, with one hand at her chest and the other gripping the arm of the chair. "It's not my heart," Evelyn said before Mara could speak. "I don't think it's my heart. I got dizzy. I sat down." Mara crouched in front of her and looked at her face color okay, breathing steady if shallow. "How long have you been dizzy?" "Since this morning. On and off." She paused. "I should have said something this morning." "Yes," Mara said. "You should have." She drove her to the clinic in Caldwell, the 20-minute drive made in a silence that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, but simply the weight of 2 people sitting with something neither of them could yet name. The clinic doctor, young, thorough, better than Mara had expected from a town clinic, ran tests, and came back with the word that Mara had been half expecting for months without knowing she'd been expecting it. Congestive heart failure, early stage, manageable with medication and monitoring and certain adjustments that the doctor described with the careful specificity of someone explaining a new protocol. Evelyn listened to all of it with her hands in her lap and her face completely calm. She asked 3 questions. She thanked the doctor. In the truck on the way home, she looked out the passenger window at the Missouri countryside going past and didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "I've been watching you build something." Let me say it," she said. Her voice was steady. I've been watching you build something since November of last year. Since before that, really since you came home from school in May, and I saw your face and I thought, this child has a plan that she doesn't fully know she has yet. She paused. I want to say what I think about it while I can say it clearly. Mara kept her eyes on the road. Her throat was doing something she didn't want it to do. You took a thing nobody wanted, Evelyn said. You took it because of the arithmetic and because of something underneath the arithmetic that I'm not sure you even have a name for. And you turned it into what's out there on that South 60. What Caleb is serving on Friday nights. What Gideon Rusk is beginning to understand about his own East pasture. She paused. You did that. Not Silas laid the groundwork. But you built it. You're the one who asked the right question. Mara said nothing for a moment. The road curved south toward the farm, and she followed it. It was your question too, Mara said. You're the one who told me about the journals. I told you they existed. You're the one who went up that ladder. They drove the last 5 minutes, in silence, and pulled into the driveway, and Mara parked and turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment. I'm not going anywhere immediately, Evelyn said. The doctor was clear about that. This is a manageable thing. I know. But things get managed for a while, and then they don't. She turned and looked at Mara directly, with the same clear, undeflecting gaze she'd used for every difficult thing in the 20 years she'd been raising this particular girl. I need to know you understand what you've built. Not as a thank you to me or to Silas. As a fact about yourself. Mara looked at her aunt. She thought about all the things she could say and the ways she could say them, all the language that would be true but would also somehow be insufficient. She thought about a yellow notebook full of temperature readings and hay consumption figures and rotation schedules and an old man's journals full of rainfall measurements and soil observations and a 40-year argument with himself about what the land was and what it could become, and how both of those things had needed the other to be complete. I understand, she said. Evelyn nodded once. Good. She opened the truck door and got out, moving with the careful economy of someone managing a hip and now a heart, and walked toward the house at the measured pace that was still the pace of a woman who intended to keep walking. The spring moved forward. Mara managed the new calves, managed the rotation, managed the protocol documentation that the collective was asking for as they formalized the arrangement with the additional producer partners. She managed Evelyn's medication schedule with the same discipline she brought to the cattle health, protocols written down, timed, non-negotiable, and Evelyn let her manage it without argument, which was itself a form of communication. Dale Prentice's 12 acres came through spring, looking better than either of them had expected. He called her in May with a quality in his voice that she recognized because she'd had it herself, the quality of someone who has seen a thing work that they were not entirely sure would work, and is still slightly surprised. The switchgrass came in on the drainage, he said. Like you said it would. Seedbank does the work, she said. Once you get out of the way. I spent 30 years not getting out of the way, he said. There was something in his voice that was more than observation. Most people do, she said. It's not obvious that getting out of the way is doing something. It looks like doing nothing. It takes a different kind of discipline. Gideon Rusk's East 40 was another story slower, more complicated, requiring 2 full years off production and 1 replanting intervention in the fall of the first year when the native seed bank proved more depleted than either of them had hoped. He bore the cost of the production loss without complaint, which surprised her. He came out to the South 60 in June and stood at the fence and watched the cattle and said, "How do you know when to move them?" She stood beside him and watched the animals in the second section. "They tell you," she said, not in words, in where they are in the section. When they start working the corners and the fence lines, the good growth in the middle is gone. Move them then, not before and not after. How long did it take you to see that? About 6 months, she said honestly. The first few rotations I moved them too early because I was scared of overgrazing. The journals told me the interval, but I didn't trust the interval until I'd watched it work. He was quiet. Then the article in the magazine. About you. What about it? I've had 3 people ask me if I know you, he said. People I do business with. People in Kansas City. She looked at him sideways. What did you say? I said I know her farm better than I know her, which is probably true. He paused. I said she's the best thing that's happened to this county's land in 20 years. She didn't say anything. She looked at the cattle and let the statement sit in the air between them without rushing to dismiss it or accept it. That might be too strong, he said, but it's in the right direction. Ask me in 5 years, she said, when we know what the land looks like. The years Mara turned 21, three things happened that she would later identify as the markers of the operation becoming something with its own weight and forward momentum. Fletcher Odom's collective expanded to include 2 new restaurant partners, which brought the annual production requirement to exactly the number she'd projected in the kitchen 2 years earlier. Dale Prentice started his own protocol documentation, filling composition notebooks with the same kind of data she'd been keeping since November, and sent her copies at the end of each month with margin notes that were increasingly confident. And a young man named Terrence from a failing farm 20 miles south showed up at her gate on a Saturday morning, asking if she was the one who'd figured out the native grass system. He was 19. He was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and carrying a folder of papers that turned out to be printouts of the magazine article and some notes he'd taken about his own land. He looked at her across the gate with the specific expression of someone who has driven 20 miles on the strength of a hope they're not sure is reasonable. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about a stockyard in November and a number written in a yellow notebook and an old man's journals in a box under a broken saddle. "Come through the gate," she said. "I'll show you the South 60. He walked the land with her for 2 hours, asking questions, listening to the answers, writing things down in a spiral notebook he pulled from his coat pocket. He was not quick the way some people are quick. He was the other kind of smart, the kind that needs to sit with something before it makes sense, the kind that would have seemed slow to people looking for fast and would have been underestimated by exactly those people. At the end of the walk, she stood at the south gate with him, and he looked back at the 60. The grass was full and moving in the April wind, the cattle in the third section making the slow, deliberate progress of animals that are exactly where they should be, and he was quiet for a while. "What did it cost you," he said, "the first year?" She thought about how to answer that truthfully. "Everything I had," she said. "Not just the money. The time and the work and the it costs you, the version of yourself that quits when things get difficult. You spend that version in the first winter, and you don't get it back." He looked at her. He was 19 and thin, and his farm was failing, and he'd driven 20 miles on a hope. "Is it worth it?" She looked at the South 60, at the restored prairie that she and a dead man's journals and 59 surviving calves had made out of 60 acres of brush and neglect, at the cattle that were the children, in a sense, of the calves that nobody had wanted, moving through grass that nobody had believed was there. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way you're hoping I'll say yes. Not because it worked out. Because working toward the right thing is worth it regardless. If this had failed, if the calves had all died, and the grass hadn't come back, and the restaurant hadn't sold out, the work would still have been the right work. That doesn't make it hurt less if it fails. It just means the worth of the thing isn't only in the outcome." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've heard something they already knew, but hadn't heard said aloud. "Okay," he said. She gave him what she could give him: the rotation protocol, the notes on reading land, a copy she'd made of the key pages from Silas's journals, which she'd been photocopying at the library and giving to people who came asking since January. She couldn't give him the South 60 itself, or the 2 years of work she'd put into it, or the specific knowledge that only comes from watching the same piece of ground change through 4 seasons. That part he'd have to build himself. He drove away the same way Fletcher and Dale and Gideon had driven away down the gravel road to the county highway, engine diminishing, dust settling behind the truck. She stood at the gate until she couldn't hear it anymore, and then she turned back to the South 60 and went through the gate and walked the land the way she walked it every day, with the notebook and without ceremony, counting, looking, writing down what she saw. Evelyn died on a Thursday morning in late October, 3 years to the month after Mara had come home with 76 calves in a trailer and $6 less in her pocket. She died in her own bed, in her own room, with the window open because she'd asked for it, in the way she'd done everything directly, on her own terms, without drama. The doctor said it was her heart, which everyone had known for 2 years was the likely way of it, and Mara sat beside her through the night before. and held her hand, and they talked sometimes, and were silent sometimes. And at around 4 in the morning, Evelyn said, "The northeast corner of the South 60. "What about it?" Mara said. "The cedar scrub you were going to clear this winter." "I know. I'll get to it. Don't leave it another year." Silas always said the northeast corner had the best soil on the whole 60. He was probably right. He usually was, Mara said. Evelyn was quiet for a while. Outside, the October dark was complete and still. "You're going to be fine," she said. Not as reassurance, exactly. More as an observation, the kind you make when you've been watching something long enough to be reasonably certain. "I know," Mara said. She wasn't entirely sure which was the honest version. But she'd learned from Evelyn and from Silas's journals and from a year of mornings with a yellow notebook in a cold barn that certainty was not the point. The point was the next thing, and the thing after that, and the willingness to keep asking the land the right question until the land answered. Evelyn died at 6:47 in the morning, while the light was coming up over the South 60 and the big blue stem was moving in the October wind with the copper-colored late-season fullness that Silas had written about in the 9th journal, the one where he'd finally put into words what he'd been circling for 30 years, that the land was not the problem, had never been the problem, would answer correctly every time, if you asked it the right thing. Mara stayed in the house until 8. Then she went outside and walked the South 60. Not for the notebook, not for the rotation check. Just walked it. Let the grass be tall around her, and the cold air move, and the cattle do what cattle do, which is exist in the present tense without complication or apology. She walked from the southwest corner where she'd started clearing in January 3 years ago through the second section and the third, along the creek seep where the switchgrass grew thick and blue-green, up through the recovering northeast corner where the soil was deepest, and the grass was catching up to the rest. She walked the whole 60 acres and came out at the south gate and stood there. The steer with the notch in his left ear was in the 3rd section. He raised his head when she came to the gate and looked at her with the familiar, measuring gaze, and then went back to grazing. She had 4 yellow notebooks full of data. She had 11 of Silas's journals and a farmhouse that needed a new roof on the south side, but not as urgently as it had 3 years ago. She had a contract with a regional collective, a working relationship with 3 neighboring producers, and a small restaurant on Clement Street that sold out on Fridays. She had 60 acres of restored native prairie that had been asking the wrong question for 50 years and was now, finally, being asked the right one. She had a farm that was hers. Not in the sense that she owned the deed, which she did. Evelyn had transferred it 2 years before her death, quietly, without announcement, the way Evelyn did things she considered obvious. But hers in the deeper sense, the sense that she had put her hands into this ground, and her years into this grass, and her grief, and her stubbornness, and her specific kind of intelligence that other people had spent a long time underestimating. She opened the notebook to the next blank page and wrote the date. She wrote Evelyn's name at the top of the page. She didn't write anything else under it. She left the rest of the page blank, which felt right, a page that was honoring rather than recording, a different use of the same notebook. Then she turned to the next page and started the day's count. 57 in the current rotation. 14 new calves in the recovery pen, already looking better than the week before. Northeast corner clearing to begin this winter. Spring purchasing to plan. The collective meeting in February where she'd need to have next year's projections ready, and the conversation with Terrence she'd promised for next month when he came back to report on his first season. The work ahead of her was very large. It had always been very large. That had turned to be the thing about work that is worth doing. Not that it gets smaller, but that you get better at knowing what to do with the size of it. She finished the count. She closed the notebook. The South 60 was alive around her in the October morning, full of the specific, inarticulate patient intelligence of land that has been asked the right question and is answering as fully as it can, which is to say, still growing, still rooted, still here. She walked back through the gate and went on to the next thing.